On the morning of the 4th of August, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits was rushing around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband, Barry, who was busy washing the last of the breakfast dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a clean coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and just like any other Tuesday, they were both getting ready for what they knew would be busy days at work. Charlotte was a well-respected school administrator for the local district, and Barry was the acting mayor of their small town, a tight-knit community of about 9,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As Barry dried his hands and left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room table, Charlotte, who was pouring herself a cup of coffee, reminded him about her schedule. She had a hair appointment later that morning, and she also wanted to let him know she'd probably be home later than usual. The reason was she had a difficult meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. You see, Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a tense and complicated legal battle. The battle was with her own cousin, a man named Wayne, and it was all over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had been quite successful and had left a lot of valuable land directly to Charlotte. But her cousin Wayne believed that he deserved a piece of that land too. So he was formally contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their respective lawyers were all scheduled to meet and try to hash things out once and for all. Barry turned to Charlotte and asked if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. Had she made up her mind about what to do? Charlotte just shook her head and said no, she was still thinking it over. She knew deep down she didn't want to just give up the land her uncle had specifically left to her. But at the same time, she hated the idea of tearing her family apart over money. It just wasn't worth it to her. Barry walked over to where she was standing, and he put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He told her that whatever happened, no matter what she decided, the family would get through it together. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and then he left for work. Once Barry was out the door, Charlotte finished her coffee and left the kitchen. She walked up the stairs and knocked gently on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. As soon as her knuckles rapped against the wood, Charlotte heard a low groan from inside the room. She opened the door, just a crack, and peered inside. She found Kara curled up in bed, looking very tired and very pale. Charlotte knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager trying to get out of going to school. The reason Kara looked and sounded the way she did was because she was pregnant and she was dealing with some pretty severe morning sickness. Now, to be honest, Charlotte was not at all thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But what made it even worse for her was that she absolutely could not stand Kara's boyfriend, a young man named Dave Reed. In Charlotte's eyes, Dave was nothing but trouble. He drank too much, he was constantly getting into minor scrapes with the law, and he was just not the kind of person Charlotte wanted her daughter to be with. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had actually forbidden her from seeing Dave. They had laid down the law and told her you cannot date him anymore. But in secret, the two teenagers had continued to see each other. And now, Kara was pregnant. So, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment in her daughter's choices. But she also knew, more than ever, that her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her, not just to finish high school, but also to navigate the challenges of being a teen mom. So, for the time being, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. With that in mind, she stepped into the bedroom and softly asked Kara how she was feeling. Kara just kind of shrugged from under the covers and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded. She walked around the room, tidying up a little bit as she spoke. Then she reminded Kara that her older sister, Heather, was coming home from college that night. She said it would be really nice if they could all have dinner together as a family. Kara told her that she did have a babysitting job that would take up most of the day, but she promised she would be home in time for dinner. Charlotte was pleased to hear that. She told Kara she would see her later that night, said goodbye, and then explained that she had to get going to work herself. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went back downstairs, grabbed her purse from the entryway table, and headed out through the garage to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30, Charlotte's car was driving back down her quiet residential street, heading toward her house. She lived in a respectable, upper-middle-class neighborhood where pretty much all the neighbors knew each other by name. Historically, crime had been very low in the area. Although it was true that recently there had been a string of robberies nearby which had put some of the residents on edge. But for the most part, Charlotte and her family always felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, then she'd gone to the salon for her scheduled haircut, and pretty soon she needed to get back to the office for a few more hours before her big afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. The thing was, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked immediately after leaving the salon. She always felt it was a bit too styled. So she wanted to make a quick stop at her house to restyle it herself before heading back to work to finish up her day. She pulled her car into the garage, got out, and ran inside the house. She went straight upstairs to the master bathroom. And just as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs. The sound surprised her. She thought Kara was already off at her babysitting job, and Barry almost never came home for his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down on the counter and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter Heather pulled her car up to the house. She had just arrived from her college, which was located a few towns away, and she was really excited to see her parents and her sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something a little odd. She saw that the main garage door was wide open, and her mom's car was parked inside. This surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had specifically said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6 o'clock that evening. But Heather didn't think too much of it. She just figured her mom's plans had changed. So she grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of big grocery bags filled with her belongings out of the back seat of her car. Then, as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw that the interior door, the one that led from the garage into the kitchen, was already open, but just a crack. This was also kind of strange. There was no real reason for that door to be left ajar. And so now, sensing that maybe something was a little bit off, Heather walked up to the door and slowly pushed it open. She called out for her mother, asking what she was doing home so early. But there was no answer. The house was completely silent. Heather stepped into the kitchen and set down her hamper and the bags on the floor. Then she began walking through the first floor of the house, trying to figure out where her mom was. She couldn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She walked from the kitchen, through the dining room, and as she rounded the corner into the main foyer, she saw her. Her mom was lying at the foot of the stairs, completely motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom's side and grabbed her, trying to see if she was okay. But when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold to the touch. In a panic, Heather ran into the living room, snatched the phone from its cradle, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and his siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. He had been very surprised when the dispatcher had told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's acting mayor, Barry Waits. As he pulled up in front of the home, he saw a young woman come running out the front door crying hysterically. Lieutenant Carter stopped his patrol car, got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who immediately begged him to come inside and help her mom. Carter and the young woman rushed over to the house together. He told her to stay outside on the porch while he went in to investigate. And she did. She stayed out front, just quietly weeping to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door. And right away, just inside the foyer, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase. She was completely still. Nearby, the contents of a woman's purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down beside the woman and felt for a pulse on her neck, but there was nothing. So, Carter stood back up and just took a moment to assess the scene. The first thing he noticed was that there was a bit of foam at the corner of the woman's mouth. This made him wonder if maybe she had suffered a seizure or some sort of severe allergic reaction at the top of the stairs. Maybe she had lost her balance and fallen, and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed that there were a few distinct drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he saw that there were very obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a dark red mark that went all the way around her neck. And in that moment, he realized this woman had likely not just fallen down the stairs. It looked like she had been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled to death. Later that day, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Richard Carter was carefully sorting through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half an hour, he and his team had been scouring the crime scene for any possible clues, and now he was holding two white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots. They looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to bag the towels as evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood even belonged to Charlotte, but if it did, it could be a very important clue. After searching the entire house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. The television and other valuables were all still in their proper places. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but all of her cash and her credit cards were still inside her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a simple robbery gone wrong. He thought that maybe the killer had just dumped out the purse at the very end to try to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a very weak attempt. This did not look like a robbery at all. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard a commotion coming from near the front door. He went to go see what was going on, and he saw a man out on the doorstep who was literally being physically held back by two of his forensics officers. After a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside to prevent him from seeing the scene, but Barry pushed right past them. And right away, he saw what they were trying to keep him from seeing. He saw his wife's body lying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze in place and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room. He sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't catch his breath. Barry was gasping for air and was really struggling to breathe. Then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. Carter thought for a second that he might be having a heart attack. So, instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked if he could see Barry Waits. But the nurse told him he would have to wait. They were still running tests on Barry, and he couldn't have any visitors until they were absolutely sure that he was stable. Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this, not because he was desperate to get in there and console the grieving mayor. It was because he needed to talk to the mayor. As the spouse of a potential murder victim, he needed to know what Barry knew as soon as possible. So, he turned to leave. But before he did, he noticed two young women sitting in the waiting room. One of them was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather. Carter and Heather had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day, when she was the one who came running out and directed him inside. They had talked a little bit, but Carter thought to himself, you know what? If I can't talk to Barry right now, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation. And so, he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up, and she definitely recognized who he was. She sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter walked over and sat down next to her. He saw that there was another girl, a teenager, sitting next to Heather. Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said that this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara. Then he asked both of them how their dad was doing. Heather explained that so far, the doctors believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was most likely a severe panic attack. But they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed incredibly upset. They had tears in their eyes, and they both appeared to be in a state of shock. They hadn't really done anything suspicious, but Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them what they knew. By this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 o'clock that morning. It wasn't until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon that her coworkers had called her house because she hadn't come back to the office. They said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. With that timeline in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they had been during that specific window of time. Kara told him that she had been babysitting all day, and Heather said she had been at her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 o'clock that afternoon, when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother or who might have wanted to hurt her. The girls immediately shook their heads and said, "Absolutely not. There was no one. Their mom was wonderful and everybody seemed to like her." They insisted they were just a happy, normal family with no major issues that they knew of. Carter jotted all of this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct, debriefing with the other investigators who were assigned to Charlotte's case. He had listened to the local news on the radio while he was driving to work that morning. And since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. By this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out completely. Neither of the daughters could have been at the house between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. Now, the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned all of Charlotte's neighbors and her coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, none of that had led to any new suspects. Another point of frustration was that the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this early stage in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband, but he was still in the hospital and was not being allowed to speak to the police. But just as Carter and the other officers were sort of scratching their heads, wondering what their next move was going to be, the front door of the precinct opened. And who walked in but Barry Waits himself? A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital. They had determined that his heart was fine and that he had indeed just had a severe panic attack. So, as soon as he was out of the hospital, he had come right over to the police station to see what he could do to help with the investigation. Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day that Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say that he had left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop had been closed, so he had gone right back to work. And he had stayed there until around 4:30, when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather, telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter was primarily just looking at Barry's hands and his arms. He was looking for any scratches or cuts or bruises. The running theory, based on what they had seen at the crime scene, was that Charlotte had put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed. And so presumably there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, most likely on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, he could see no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. So, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was telling the truth and that he wasn't a suspect. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was being honest. At some point, Carter shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said yes, he did. He said there were actually 2 people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He explained that the first person was a guy named Dave Reed, who was their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was a bad influence, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. So Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to the house to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things had gotten out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem for Charlotte. Barry explained that his wife and her cousin, Wayne, were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said, Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys on the very same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up straight in his chair. He thought to himself that the timing here could not possibly be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a single word without his lawyer present. And this had immediately made Carter pretty suspicious. During that very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he leaned right in and started to grill him. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family, but he swore that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. In fact, he claimed she had been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself just wasn't worth the conflict. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised. Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option on the table. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he had literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch that day, which was something he typically did. He insisted he was at work, truly, all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several of his coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. Wayne immediately looked over at his attorney. His attorney gave him a slight nod. And so Wayne looked back at Carter and said, "Okay." Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish. He just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he had been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, "Yeah, I do." He had heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew that given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was completely absurd. Carter just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. Dave admitted that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte or Barry for that matter. And he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He had been at work all day, at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints. Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You're wasting your time," but he agreed to do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk, flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had initially thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the two long strings that were dangling from her neckline and had used them to strangle her to death. She had also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. This level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the physical evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints that had been found at the crime scene. 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise at all because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was unidentified. And it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So, at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. To make matters worse, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well. So, truly, his list of suspects was basically down to 0. If Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was still the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt a sense of dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every single day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down. Carter and his team had to take valuable time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and wild conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They had also investigated another local man who had strangled his girlfriend in a way that was similar to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out that this criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Adding to the confusion, their fingerprint expert had told Carter that the third unidentified set of prints found at the scene could possibly belong to a child, and so it might be totally unrelated to the murder. So now, as Carter looked over at the desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced himself for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was indeed more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress in the investigation. As difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to all the pressure he was feeling that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, he also understood their frustration. He was feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends, he was completely out of ideas. And he had a sinking feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the investigation had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather had graduated from college and was working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much involved in local politics. In fact, just the previous year, he had run for a term on the city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the bizarre fact that he had a dream about it, all the media attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case. And calls had once again begun flowing into the tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and local gossip. But on that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office door, Carter looked up and saw that the sergeant was visibly excited. Whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him what he had heard, the desk sergeant said he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share, information that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, the forensic evidence and new witness testimony, this is what police believe actually happened to Charlotte Waits on the 4th of August, 1998. Around 11:30 in the morning, the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house, and right away, they recognized Charlotte's car parked in the garage. When they saw it, their heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety because they hadn't been sure that she would even be home. But clearly, the killer had arrived at just the right time. So they parked their car at the end of the driveway, they walked up into the open garage, and they went over to the interior door that led into the house. They tried the handle and found that it was unlocked. So they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away they heard footsteps on the second floor. They knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home at this time of day. The killer quietly closed the door behind them. They went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them standing there. Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them. The killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. So, the killer tried to get her to change her mind to answer this question differently. But the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. And then, the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte hard across the face. Blood immediately began pouring from Charlotte's nose. Stunned, she just stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. At this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line. Persuading Charlotte to do what they wanted was now clearly out of the question. This was a point of no return. So, as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with a towel pressed to her face, looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind. They clutched the long strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer had her in an unbreakable chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. When the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, motionless and very likely dead, the reality of what had just happened finally hit them. In a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped on the floor. They rushed down the stairs and quickly cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, and then they dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then, they grabbed Charlotte's purse off a nearby table and scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was just a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten himself into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it all off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and confronted Charlotte, asking her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped. He killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he desperately needed more money. He was thinking, okay, I'm only going to get half of this inheritance because she's giving the other half to Wayne. But if I kill her, I'll also get her life insurance policy, and then together I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder early on in the investigation, the company refused to pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money directly to their daughters, Heather and Cara. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Cara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he truly was. And so, it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips himself to redirect attention away from him. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Back in 1991, a young man named Brian Kendall and his family were starting to feel completely overwhelmed by the chaotic pace of city life. Brian was a skilled carpenter by trade, and he spent his days working hard in the bustling city of Baltimore, Maryland. He was good at what he did, and there was always plenty of work for a talented carpenter in the city, but the long hours, the traffic, and the constant noise of Baltimore were starting to wear him down. He spent his days framing houses, building staircases, and crafting custom cabinets, but the dust, the heat, and the cold of the city were beginning to take their toll. More than that, Brian and his wife Belinda were starting to feel deeply concerned about the environment they were raising their young children in. They had 2 beautiful kids, a 5-year-old daughter named Blair and a 3-year-old son named Sean. The neighborhood they lived in back in Baltimore just did not feel safe anymore. Crime was on the rise, and they found themselves constantly worrying about the safety of their little ones. They had to keep the kids cooped up indoors most of the time because they were too afraid to let them play outside in the yard without constant hawk-like supervision. It was no way for children to grow up, and both Brian and Belinda knew it. They wanted their children to experience the same freedom they had enjoyed when they were young. Both of them had grown up in the beautiful, wide-open countryside of West Virginia, where the air was clean, the trees were thick, and you could run around outside for hours without a single worry in the world. They wanted that peaceful, rural lifestyle back. And so, they made a massive decision. They decided to pack up all their belongings, leave Baltimore, and move back to West Virginia. This was not going to be an easy move, especially for Brian. He still had to keep his carpentry job in Baltimore to support the family, which meant he would face a brutal multi-hour daily commute just to get to work and back. But to Brian and Belinda, the sacrifice seemed entirely worth it if it meant their children could grow up in a safe, peaceful environment where they could play outside and just be kids. They began searching for the perfect home, and eventually they found a listing for a property in a tiny, unincorporated community called Slanesville, West Virginia. Slanesville was about as rural as you could get. At the time, the entire population of the town was only about 182 people. The house they found was located deep in the countryside, set back far from any paved roads, down a long, winding gravel driveway. When they first drove up to see it, they realized just how isolated it truly was. The house itself was a beautiful ranch-style home, which meant it was a single-story building. It had a very rustic, cozy cabin feel to it, with wooden siding and a large front porch that blended right into the surrounding landscape. And when you stood on that porch and looked out, all you could see in every single direction was pure, dense forest. There were no neighbors for miles. There were no busy streets, no city sirens, and no hum of traffic. It was just acres and acres of towering trees, quiet whispering winds, and nature. To Brian and Belinda, this felt like an absolute paradise. It was the complete opposite of Baltimore. They felt an immediate sense of relief and safety. Here, they could finally let Blair and Sean play outside in the fresh air without any fear. But even though the isolation felt incredibly peaceful, they also knew that being that far out in the middle of nowhere could get a little lonely and maybe even a bit daunting at night when the forest went completely black. To help make the place feel even more secure, Brian went out and got a pet for the family. He brought home a gorgeous, friendly black Labrador retriever named Coco. From the very first moment Coco arrived at the property, she fit right in. She was incredibly sweet and gentle with the kids, but she was also highly alert and protective. If anyone or anything approached the house, Coco was right there, watching and listening. The family absolutely adored her, and she quickly became an inseparable part of their daily lives. The move was a complete success, and for the first couple of weeks, life in Slanesville was absolutely perfect. Not long after they had fully unpacked all their boxes and settled into their new home, Belinda decided it was time to celebrate. She wanted to show off the beautiful new house to her family, so she invited her brother, his wife, and their young daughter Jordan to come over for a visit. Jordan was a sweet little toddler, about 2 or 3 years old, which made her just a bit younger than Blair and Sean. Jordan had recently celebrated her birthday, and since the family had been so busy moving, they had not been able to celebrate with her. Belinda decided to turn the family visit into a surprise birthday party for little Jordan. She went into town, bought a beautiful birthday cake, and picked up a bunch of bright, colorful helium balloons. When her brother and his family arrived, the surprise went off flawlessly. They all laughed, enjoyed the cake, and watched Jordan open a few small gifts. After the cake was finished, the children took all the helium balloons and headed into the living room to play. The living room was directly adjacent to the kitchen, separated only by a large open archway. The adults stayed behind in the kitchen, sitting around the wooden table, drinking coffee, and chatting about how wonderful the new house was and how quiet the forest was. As they were talking, their conversation slowly drifted off because they all noticed something very strange happening in the living room. The kids had let go of the balloons, and because they were filled with helium, they had all floated up to the high, vaulted ceiling of the living room. But then, right before their eyes, one of the balloons began to slowly descend. It did not drop the way a balloon normally does when it is losing air. Instead, the balloon came straight down, and the string hanging from it was completely straight and taut. It looked exactly as if an invisible hand was holding the end of the string and gently pulling it downward. The adults stopped talking completely. They just sat there in silence, staring through the archway, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The balloon came to a complete stop right in the middle of the room, hovering a few feet off the floor. It was far away from where the kids were playing, and the children had not even noticed it yet. Then, the balloon began to move horizontally. It glided slowly and smoothly across the living room, moving directly toward little Jordan. It was a completely unnatural movement. There was no wind in the house, and all the windows were closed. As the balloon drifted right up to Jordan, she noticed it for the first time. She stopped playing, turned around, and looked directly at the empty space right next to the balloon. With a big smile on her face, she politely said, "Thank you." She spoke as if she was talking directly to a real person standing right in front of her. Then, Jordan reached out her tiny hand to grab the string of the balloon. But just as her fingers were about to touch it, the balloon suddenly drifted straight back up to the ceiling, moving quickly as if whoever had been holding it had suddenly let go. Jordan tried to reach for it again, but when she could not reach it, she simply shrugged, turned back around, and went back to playing with her cousins. The adults in the kitchen were absolutely stunned. They looked at each other, their faces pale, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Belinda and her brother stood up and walked into the living room. They grabbed the string of the balloon, pulled it down, and tried to let it go to see if it would behave the same way. But every time they let it go, it simply floated straight up to the ceiling, drifting slightly with the normal air currents. It did not move horizontally, and the string did not stay taut. They looked at each other, feeling a chill run down their spines. Belinda walked over to little Jordan, knelt down to her eye level, and asked her who she had been talking to just a moment ago. Jordan, being so young, did not really know how to explain it. Belinda asked her again, pointing to the spot where the balloon had floated. She asked, "When the balloon came down to you, who were you saying thank you to?" Jordan stopped playing, looked at the empty space, and then pointed her finger directly at a corner of the room where absolutely no one was standing. She looked at her aunt and simply said, "Him." The parents looked at the empty corner, and then they looked at each other. To break the sudden heavy tension in the room, they all started to laugh. They told themselves that they were just scaring each other over nothing. They reasoned that there must have been a subtle draft in the room, perhaps from the heating system, and that the helium in the balloon was just slightly leaking. And as for Jordan, they decided she was only 3 years old and probably just had an active imagination or an imaginary friend. They agreed to drop the subject and forget about the balloon. And so they went back to their coffee, finished the party, and eventually her brother's family packed up and went home. But even though they had laughed it off, both Belinda and Brian could not shake the feeling that something incredibly bizarre had just happened in their new home. Over the next few days, they would occasionally bring it up to each other, admitting that the way the balloon moved was simply impossible to explain. A few days after the party, Brian had a rare afternoon off from his carpentry work. Because he had been working so much and spending so many hours commuting, he had not yet had a chance to really explore the vast forest that surrounded their new property. He decided that today was the perfect day to do it. He looked at his young daughter, Blair, who was 5 years old, and asked her if she wanted to go on an adventure with him in the woods. Blair was absolutely thrilled. She loved spending time with her dad, and the idea of exploring the deep forest behind their house sounded incredibly exciting. The two of them stepped out of the back door, walked past the edge of the manicured yard, and entered the dense tree line. The forest was beautiful, filled with tall oak and pine trees, and the ground was covered in a soft layer of fallen leaves and pine needles. They walked for a while, enjoying the peace and quiet, listening to the birds chirping high in the canopy. But after they had walked a considerable distance away from the house, deep into the woods where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely filtered through, they suddenly came to a halt. In a small clearing in the very middle of the dense forest, where there were absolutely no roads, pathways, or driveways, they saw something that looked completely out of place. It was a large vehicle. As they walked closer, Brian realized it was the metallic frame of an old van. But this van had been completely destroyed. It was entirely charred and blackened from top to bottom, indicating that it had been set on fire at some point in the past. The tires were gone, the glass in the windows had melted away, the paint was burned off, and it was essentially just a rusted, hollow metal shell sitting quietly among the trees. Brian, feeling a sudden wave of curiosity mixed with unease, walked up to the back of the burned-out van to look inside. Blair followed closely behind him. When they peered through the broken rear doors, they saw a sight that made Brian's stomach drop. Scattered across the charred floor of the vehicle were the remains of dozens of children's toys and stuffed animals. They were all partially melted, blackened by soot, and ruined by the fire. And right in the middle of the vehicle, there was a large, twisted metal frame. It was the inner springs of a mattress, completely stripped of its fabric, which had obviously been consumed by the same intense fire that destroyed the van. Brian stood there, staring at the scene, and a heavy, sinking feeling washed over him. He did not know what had happened here, but every instinct in his body screamed that something was terribly wrong with this scene. He looked down at Blair, who was staring curiously at the burned, stuffed animals. Brian immediately grabbed her hand, pulled her back, and said that they needed to go home right away. He told her not to look at it anymore, and that they did not need to be playing around this vehicle. They turned around and walked quickly back to the house. When they got back, Brian immediately told Belinda about what they had found in the woods. They both sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of it. How could a large van have gotten so deep into the forest when there were no roads leading to that spot? Why would someone drive a van out there, fill it with children's toys and a mattress, and then set the entire thing on fire? It did not make any sense, and it left both of them feeling incredibly uneasy about the land they were living on. Over the next couple of months, the reality of their new lifestyle began to set in. Brian was trying his absolute best to commute back and forth from Slanesville to Baltimore every single day. But the commute was taking a massive toll on his health. It was taking up hours and hours of his day, and he was getting almost no sleep. He would leave the house in the pitch black of early morning, drive for hours, work a physically demanding job as a carpenter, and then drive all the way back in the dark. It was becoming incredibly dangerous for him to drive while so exhausted. And so, even though the family only owned one vehicle, they had to make a difficult compromise. They decided that Brian would leave the house early on Monday morning, drive to Baltimore, and stay with his mother, who lived in Maryland, during the week. Then, on Friday night, he would drive back to West Virginia to spend the weekend with his family. But the problem was, this arrangement meant that from Monday to Friday, Belinda, Blair, and Sean were completely alone in their isolated cabin in the woods, with absolutely no vehicle and no way to leave the property if an emergency occurred. However, Belinda had grown up in an extremely isolated home in the middle of the West Virginia forest herself, so she was not a stranger to this kind of lifestyle. She was a strong, independent woman, and she felt confident that she could handle things while Brian was away. Ever since they had moved into the house, 5-year-old Blair had been begging her parents to let her go camping in the family's small RV camper. The camper was parked right outside the house, on the edge of the driveway near the tree line. Blair thought it would be the ultimate adventure to spend a night out there by herself. Belinda had repeatedly said no, feeling that Blair was too young. But one week, while Brian was away in Baltimore for work, Blair asked again. Belinda looked at her kids and realized they were starting to get a bit of cabin fever. They had been cooped up inside the house for days, and she wanted to do something to make them happy. And so, she finally caved. She told Blair that she could spend one night sleeping in the camper. Belinda was not entirely thrilled about the idea, but she wanted to make her daughter happy. She established some very strict rules. She told Blair that once she went inside the camper, she had to lock the door immediately and not open it again for any reason. And to make sure Blair was safe, she decided that their protective black lab, Coco, would stay in the camper with her. Blair was perfectly fine with this setup. As night began to fall, Blair put on her warmest clothes, grabbed a portable lantern, and took a few of her favorite books to read. Belinda walked her out to the camper, tucked her into the bed, and gave her a kiss on the forehead. She reminded Blair to lock the door behind her, and then she headed back into the main house, leaving Coco to guard the little girl. Inside the camper, the layout was quite simple. There was a pull-out bed that took up the vast majority of the floor space. As Blair lay down on the bed, there was a very large window directly to her right. This window was equipped with a thick blackout curtain that slid across the entire length of the glass, and Blair made sure that this curtain was pulled completely shut. At the foot of her bed, also to her right, was the main door that led outside. The door had a small window on it as well, but this window did not have any blinds or curtains to block the view. At some point in the evening, Blair finished reading her books, turned off her lantern, and snuggled under her warm blankets. Coco curled up right next to her at the foot of the bed, and before long, Blair drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, Blair was suddenly jarred awake. She did not know what time it was, but the camper was completely dark except for a faint silver glow of moonlight filtering through the uncovered window on the door. She realized she had been woken up because Coco was acting very strange. The dog was standing up on the bed, her body completely rigid, staring intently at the window on the front door. Coco was whining softly, moving her head back and forth as if she was trying to track something moving just outside. Blair sat up in bed, feeling a sudden chill. She tried to reach out and pet Coco to calm her down, but the dog remained focused on the door. Blair looked through the window of the door, trying to see what had caught the dog's attention. In the dim moonlight, she saw a dark, solid shape move slowly past the glass. It was definitely a figure, but because of the darkness, she could not tell if it was a person or a large animal. Coco immediately began to growl, a low, menacing sound from deep within her throat. Blair's heart started to race, but then she thought to herself that it had to be her mom. She figured her mom had probably gotten worried about her and had come outside to check on her. Wanting to calm the growling dog and let her mom in, Blair turned on her lantern, got out of bed, and walked over to the door. She unlocked the deadbolt, pushed the door open, and poked her head out into the cold night air. She looked around the dark yard, but she did not see anyone. She called out, "Mom," but there was no response. She looked up at the main house, which was only a short distance away, but all the lights were completely off. There was no sign that her mother had ever left the house. Suddenly, feeling a wave of intense fear, Blair quickly pulled her head back inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. But the whole time Blair had been at the door, Coco had not moved from the bed. Instead of following Blair to the door, Coco's head had turned, and she was now staring directly at the large window right next to the bed, the one covered by the blackout curtains. Coco's lips were pulled back, baring her sharp white teeth, and she was growling fiercely at the covered window. Blair was completely terrified now. She scrambled back onto the bed, pulled the thick covers completely over her head, and curled into a tight ball. She lay there, shivering with fear, hoping that the growling would stop and that whatever was outside would just go away. But Coco would not stop growling. Blair reached out from under the blankets and tried to pull the dog down to get under the covers with her, but Coco remained standing, her body tense, guarding her young owner. Blair realized she had to look. She convinced herself that maybe her mom had walked around to the side of the camper and was trying to look in to see if she was okay. She slowly pulled the blankets down, crawled to the edge of the bed, and positioned herself directly beneath the large window. She reached up with a trembling hand and gently pulled the edge of the blackout curtain aside just an inch or two. Through the small gap in the curtain, she looked out into the darkness. Standing right on the other side of the glass, only inches away from her face, was a dark, towering figure of a man. He was standing perfectly still, staring directly down through the window into the camper. Blair let out a silent gasp, dropped the curtain, and flew back under her blankets. Coco immediately climbed on top of her, standing directly over her body, growling savagely at the window. Blair lay there in the dark, paralyzed with fear, until eventually the exhaustion took over and she managed to fall back into a restless sleep. While Blair was experiencing this nightmare inside the camper, a different kind of drama was unfolding up at the main house. Almost immediately after she had tucked Blair into the camper, Belinda had put her 3-year-old son, Sean, to bed in his bedroom. Normally, Sean was an incredible sleeper. Belinda could put him in his bed, say goodnight, turn off the light, and she would not hear a single peep from him until the next morning. But on this particular night, things were very different. Belinda had gone to her own bedroom and fallen asleep, but after only a short while, she was woken up. Sean had crept into her room, crying, and said he was too scared to sleep in his bedroom. Belinda got out of bed, walked him back to his room, tucked him in, and assured him that he was perfectly safe. She told him it was just a new house, and that sometimes new places could feel a little scary at night. But only a little while later, Sean was back in her room again, crying. This happened 3 or 4 times, which was completely unlike him. On the final time, Belinda realized that he was truly terrified. She sat him down on her bed, looked at him, and asked what was going on. She asked, "What are you so scared of, Sean?" The little boy looked at her with wide, tearful eyes and said, "There is a monster in my window." Now, because the house was a single-story ranch home, all of the bedroom windows were located at ground level. If you looked out any of those windows at night, you were looking directly into the dark, dense forest. Belinda assumed that a wild animal, like a deer or perhaps a raccoon, had walked up close to the house and brushed against the window, and that was what had scared her son. She walked into Sean's room, went over to the window, and parted the curtains. She looked out into the deep, pitch-black forest, but she did not see anything. She turned back to Sean and explained to him that there were no monsters. She told him that because they lived in the woods now, sometimes animals like deer would come close to the house to look for food, and that he had nothing to fear. She was finally able to calm him down, and he eventually fell asleep in his bed. The next morning, Blair was incredibly relieved when she finally saw the bright morning sunlight coming through the window of the camper door. She unlocked the door and, with Coco by her side, ran as fast as she could back into the main house. Belinda was in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the kids. Blair sat down at the table, and Belinda, smiling, asked her how her big camping adventure had gone. Normally, Blair was a very talkative, energetic child who loved to share every single detail of her day. But this morning, she was completely silent. She just stared down at her plate. Belinda asked her again, "Did you have a good time?" "Are you going to tell me what you did out there?" Blair looked up at her mother, her face completely serious, and simply said, "I do not think I ever want to go camping again." She did not explain why, and she refused to elaborate on what had happened. Belinda, not wanting to push her daughter or make her feel uncomfortable, decided to drop the subject. She figured that maybe Blair had just gotten cold or lonely during the night and had realized that sleeping in a camper was not as fun as she had imagined. And so, the day went on without any further discussion about the camper. That night, Belinda got both of the kids to bed in their normal bedrooms, and she went to her own room. She fell into a deep sleep, but during the night she began to have an incredibly vivid and bizarre dream. In her dream, she woke up in her bed and looked toward the foot of the mattress. Standing there was a young boy. She had never seen him before, and he did not look like anyone from the area. The boy did not say a word, but he looked at her and gestured with his hand for her to get up and follow him. In the dream, Belinda got out of bed and followed the boy out of her bedroom, down the hallway, and out through the front door. When she stepped outside, she realized it was bright daylight. But her front yard looked completely different. There were dozens of long clotheslines strung up all across the grass, crisscrossing in every single direction. Hanging from these clotheslines were large white bed sheets. The sheets were hanging down to the ground, creating a massive, confusing maze that blocked her view of the yard. Belinda tried to follow the boy, but she quickly lost sight of him because the heavy white sheets kept getting in her way. She wandered through the maze of sheets, calling out for him. Suddenly, she stopped. She felt a sharp, pinching sensation on her right big toe. She looked down. She was completely barefoot, and clamped onto her right big toe was a wooden clothespin. She reached down, pinched the metal spring of the clothespin to release it, and pulled it off her toe. The moment she pulled it off, she woke up in real life. She sat up in her bed, her heart pounding, looking around her dark bedroom. She realized she was in her own bed, and that it had all just been a very intense, realistic dream. She let out a sigh of relief, laid back down, and went back to sleep. The next morning, Belinda got out of bed to start her day. She began to make her bed, pulling the blankets and sheets up to tidy them. As she walked around to the foot of the bed to tidy the covers, she suddenly froze. Lying on the carpet, directly at the foot of her bed, was a single wooden clothespin. Belinda stood there, staring at it in absolute disbelief. She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. Her family did not own any wooden clothespins. They used a modern dryer for their clothes, and they had never bought or used clothespins since moving into the house. She stared at the small wooden object, wondering how on earth it could have gotten there. Had she been sleepwalking? Had she somehow gone outside in her sleep, found a clothespin, and brought it back into her room? Or was there something much more terrifying happening in this house? The incident completely freaked her out, and she could not stop thinking about the strange connection between her dream and the real object on her floor. Later that day, Belinda called her sister and told her about the bizarre dream and the clothespin she had found on the floor. Her sister could hear the panic and exhaustion in Belinda's voice. She realized that Belinda was spending way too much time alone in the isolated house with the kids while Brian was away working. She told Belinda, "Look, you are just stressed and isolated. You need a break to clear your mind. I am going to come over, watch the kids for a little while, and you can go for a nice quiet walk in the woods to relax." Belinda agreed that a break would be good for her. Her sister drove over to the house, took charge of Blair and Sean, and Belinda stepped out the back door to go for her walk. She decided to head into the forest behind the house, walking slowly and taking deep breaths of the fresh mountain air, trying to calm her frayed nerves. But as she walked further into the woods, she noticed something unusual. Set back among the trees, not far from the boundary of their property, was a small, cleared area. She walked closer and realized she was looking at a tiny old cemetery. There were 4 small weathered headstones standing in a neat row. She walked up to them, expecting to read the names and dates of the people buried there, but when she looked closely at the stones, she realized they were completely blank. There was no writing, no names, and no dates carved into the stone. But what struck her the most was the size of the headstones. They were incredibly small, only a foot or 2 tall. To Belinda, the size of the graves suggested that they belonged to very young children. The discovery of this hidden cemetery so close to her home left her feeling deeply unsettled. The peaceful feeling of her walk was completely gone, replaced by a heavy sense of sadness and unease. She turned around and walked back to the house, deciding that she had had enough of her walk. A few nights later, Blair was sleeping in her bedroom. In the middle of the night, she woke up suddenly for no apparent reason. She sat up in her bed and looked toward her window. She immediately noticed that the heavy curtains, which she always insisted on keeping tightly closed, were slightly parted. She felt a sudden, familiar wave of unease. She got out of bed and walked over to the window, intending to pull the curtain shut. But as she reached for the fabric, she looked out into the yard. Standing right at the edge of the dark tree line was a solid, dark silhouette of a figure. It looked like a man standing perfectly still. Blair froze, her eyes locked on the figure. As she watched, the silhouette began to move. It started walking slowly toward her window. Blair's breath caught in her throat. And then, suddenly, the figure burst into a full sprint, running directly at her window. Terrified, Blair let out a gasp, slammed the curtains shut, jumped back into her bed, and pulled the covers over her head. At the exact same moment, in the master bedroom, Coco woke up and began to bark furiously at Belinda's window. Belinda was jarred awake by the loud, aggressive barking. She sat up and saw Coco standing on the bed, staring at the window and growling. Belinda got out of bed, walked to her window, and peered out into the darkness. She did not see anything but the quiet trees. She told Coco to calm down, figuring the dog had just heard a deer outside. To make sure her kids were okay, Belinda walked down the hallway to check on them. She first went into Sean's room. He was fast asleep, completely undisturbed by the dog's barking. Then she walked into Blair's room. She saw a large lump under the blankets on Blair's bed. She walked over, gently pulled the covers down, and saw her daughter staring up at her with a look of pure terror. Belinda knelt down and asked, "Honey, what is wrong?" "What happened?" Blair, trembling, finally found her voice. She told her mother that she had seen a person standing by the trees and that the person had suddenly started running straight toward her bedroom window. Belinda felt a chill, but she desperately wanted to keep her daughter from panicking. She looked at Blair and said, "Honey, I am sure it was just an animal." She explained that a deer or a large dog must have run across the yard, and because it was dark, it looked like a person. She told Blair that Coco had barked at the exact same thing and that there was nothing to worry about. She stayed with Blair until the little girl's breathing slowed down and she eventually fell back asleep. Belinda double-checked on Sean, who was still sleeping soundly, and then she and Coco returned to the master bedroom and got back into bed. Belinda lay in her bed, trying to calm her mind so she could go back to sleep. She turned onto her side, with her back facing the bedroom door. Just as she was finally starting to drift off, she felt a distinct, gentle tapping on the back of her head. It felt exactly like a child's finger tapping her to get her attention. Belinda, still half asleep, assumed that either Blair or Sean had crept back into her room because they were still scared. Without even opening her eyes, she whispered, "Honey, there is nothing outside. You have nothing to be scared of. Go back to sleep." There was a long silence, and then she felt the exact same distinct tapping on the back of her head again. Belinda opened her eyes, rolled over to face the room, and prepared to gently guide whichever child it was back to their bed. But when she rolled over, the room was completely empty. There was absolutely no one there. Belinda gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked down at the floor, expecting to see Sean or Blair standing by the side of the bed, but there was nothing. At that exact moment, Coco, who had been sleeping quietly next to her, stood up. The dog began to growl fiercely, her eyes locked onto the empty space right next to the bed where the tapping had just occurred. Belinda scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. She looked around the entire room, but it was completely empty. She got out of bed, her legs shaking, and walked down the hallway to check on the children. She opened Blair's door and then Sean's door. Both of her children were fast asleep in their beds, completely undisturbed. She then walked through the entire house, checking every single window and door, making sure they were all tightly locked and secured. Everything was sealed shut. She went back to her bedroom, sat on the edge of her bed with Coco, and began to cry. She was absolutely terrified. For the first time since they had moved into the beautiful cabin in Slanesville, the word haunted entered her mind. She could not explain the clothespin, she could not explain the running figure, and she certainly could not explain the physical sensation of someone tapping her head in an empty locked room. She sat awake for the rest of the night, holding on to Coco, waiting for the safety of the morning light. The next day, Belinda just wanted to get away from the house so she could clear her mind. She called her mom and asked if she could use her car for the day to go run some errands in town. Her mom said absolutely, and she drove the car over to the house and dropped it off. Belinda and the kids loaded up into the vehicle and prepared to head into town. When they left, they made sure to put Coco inside her outdoor cage. The cage was a large, sturdy enclosure in the backyard made of thick metal chain link fencing, and Belinda made sure the heavy gate was completely closed, latched, and locked. She wanted to make sure Coco was safe and secure while they were away. They got into the car and drove into the small town of Slanesville. Belinda pulled into a local gas station to fill up the tank. As she was standing by the pump fueling up her car, another resident of Slanesville pulled up right next to her. She was a friendly-looking woman who was also filling up her car, and the two women struck up a casual conversation. At some point in this discussion, the woman realized she did not recognize Belinda, so she asked her where she lived in Slanesville. Belinda described the location of their property, mentioning the long gravel dryad cry-of-way set deep back in the woods. The woman was a longtime resident and was very familiar with the area. When she heard where Belinda lived, her face changed. She looked at Belinda and asked, "Do you know the story of your property?" Belinda replied, "No, we just moved in a few months ago." The woman nodded and said, "Well, years and years ago, there was a really bad fire near your property that a whole family died in." As Belinda listened to the story, she felt a sudden, massive sense of relief. She looked at the woman and said, "You know, I actually found a small cemetery with 4 unmarked headstones a little ways back on our property." The woman nodded and said, "Yes, that is what that is." As Belinda finished pumping her gas and drove away from the station, she had a strong sense of comfort. She thought to herself that if her house was indeed haunted, it was not by something evil. It was simply the spirits of that poor family who had lost their lives in that tragic fire. It did not feel evil anymore. It just felt kind of sad. She felt a deep sense of empathy for this lost family, and she was glad to finally have some closure on why there was a cemetery on her land. But when Belinda and the kids finally got back from running those errands, their sense of peace was instantly shattered. They walked into the backyard to let Coco out of her enclosure, but when they reached the fence, they saw that Coco was completely gone. Belinda ran up to the gate, examining it closely. The heavy metal gate had not been opened, and it was still securely latched and locked. There was absolutely no sign that Coco had been able to burrow underneath the fence, and there were no broken wires. There was no way for her to get out unless someone had physically opened the gate, let her out, and then locked it back shut. They searched the entire yard, calling out Coco's name, running through the edge of the woods, whistling and searching, but there was no sign of the dog. Unfortunately, they would never see Coco again. The loss of their beloved dog was a massive blow to the family. Coco was not only a dog they loved and considered a full part of their family, but she was also their primary form of protection in those deep woods. It was a very big deal that she was gone, and the quietness of the house began to feel incredibly heavy and vulnerable. A couple of days went by, and Friday night finally arrived. Brian returned home from Baltimore for the weekend, and for a brief moment, Belinda felt safe again now that her husband was home. On Sunday night, everyone in the house was asleep except for Belinda. She was up late watching television, trying to distract her mind. At some point, she turned off the TV and went to bed. She fell into a deep sleep, and she began to have the exact same dream she had experienced before. In her dream, she woke up and looked toward the foot of her bed. Standing there was the same young boy. He gestured for her to get up and follow him, and so she did. She got out of bed and followed him out through the front of the house and out onto the front yard. Once again, the entire front yard was covered in dozens of long clotheslines with large white sheets hanging down in random directions. As she made her way across the yard, pulling the heavy white sheets aside, she finally reached a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood the young boy. He looked to be about the same age as her son Sean. But the boy looked absolutely terrified. He was trembling, and he was looking fearfully to his left. Belinda looked in that direction, and from behind one of the sheets next to the boy, a tall, dark, expressionless figure stepped out. The figure stood directly next to the boy, looking blankly at Belinda. It was a terrifying, shadowy shape of a man. The figure then turned and began to walk slowly and menacingly toward Belinda. In the dream, Belinda stumbled backward, fell onto the ground, and woke up in real life, gasping for air. But the moment she opened her eyes, she realized she was not safe. From down the hallway, a high-pitched, agonizing scream was echoing through the house. It was coming from Sean's bedroom. Belinda and Brian leaped out of bed and ran down the hallway, bursting into Sean's room. They turned on the light and saw 3-year-old Sean lying on the floor next to his bed, crying hysterically. He was holding his right arm, which was bent at a completely unnatural, horrifying angle. It was clearly broken. Belinda knelt next to him, trying to comfort him, asking, "Sean, what happened? What did you do?" The little boy, sobbing through his tears, looked at his mother and cried. The monster came in the window. They did not know what to make of this. They were not sure if an intruder had actually come into the room or if Sean had fallen out of bed and broken his arm during a nightmare. But they had to get him to the hospital immediately. They scooped Sean up, grabbed Blair from her bed, got into the car, and rushed to the nearest emergency room. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Sean had suffered a very severe clean break in his arm. Because of the severity of the fracture, they informed Brian and Belinda that Sean would need to remain hospitalized for a few days so they could monitor the injury and ensure it healed properly. This happened on a Sunday night, which meant that the next morning, Monday, Brian had to return to Baltimore for his carpentry work. Since they only had one car, Brian had to take the vehicle with him, leaving Belinda and Blair at the hospital with Sean. 3 days later, it was finally time for Sean to be discharged from the hospital. Since Belinda did not have a car, she had to call her mother to borrow her vehicle once again to go pick up her son. Belinda and Blair drove to the hospital, picked up Sean, and began the drive back to Slanesville. But as they were driving along the quiet, isolated rural road toward their house, the car suddenly began to sputter and the engine died completely. Belinda managed to pull the car over onto the shoulder of the road. She turned on the hazard flashers, sat in the driver's seat, and felt a wave of despair. They were stranded on the side of a deserted road with a young child with a broken arm, and they had no way to get home. Luckily, after a little while, another car came driving down the road. The driver, an older woman who was a longtime resident of Slanesville, saw the stranded family and pulled over. She rolled down her window and kindly offered to give them a ride home. Belinda was incredibly grateful. She, Blair, and Sean got into the woman's car, and they began driving toward the Kendall property. As they drove, Belinda gave the woman directions, telling her to turn onto the gravel road that led deep into the forest. When the older woman realized exactly where Belinda lived, she stopped talking. She looked over at Belinda in the passenger seat and said, "You do know the history of your house, right?" Belinda sighed and said, "Yes, the lady at the gas station told me about the tragic fire where the family died on the property." The older woman shook her head, her expression grim. She said, "No, that is not what happened at all. There was no fire. The last occupant of your house was rumored to be hurting children on your property." She said that because they lived in such an isolated area, there was no proof, and the local men felt that the law was not doing enough to stop him. And so, a group of local men decided to take justice into their own hands. They convinced this guy to go hunting with them in the woods behind his house. Once they brought him out into the woods, they ambushed him. His body was never officially found. But it is rumored that there is an old van somewhere in the woods near your house where they put him inside, shut the doors, and set it on fire to destroy the evidence. As the woman spoke, Belinda felt a wave of cold, paralyzing horror wash over her. Every single piece of the puzzle suddenly fell into place with terrifying clarity. The charred van in the woods that Brian and Blair had found, the one filled with burnt children's toys and the metal springs of a mattress, was not some random piece of trash. It was the actual crime scene of a vigilante murder. The man who had lived in her house before them was a monster who had tortured children in those very woods, and he had been brutally killed and burned inside that van by the local residents. The figure that Blair had seen standing outside her RV window, the silhouette that had run toward her bedroom window, the thing that had tapped Belinda's head, and the monster that Sean had seen at his window was not a harmless spirit of a tragic family. It was the lingering, malevolent energy of a horrific past, or perhaps even the physical manifestation of the dark history of the property. Belinda realized that her children had been playing on the very ground where unspeakable crimes had been committed and where a brutal act of street justice had occurred. When the woman finally pulled up to the house, Belinda thanked her, got the kids out of the car, and ran inside the house. The cabin, which had once felt like a peaceful sanctuary, now felt completely evil. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were watching her. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and called Brian in Baltimore. She told him, "I cannot stay in this house for another second. You need to come home right now. We are leaving." Brian could hear the absolute terror in his wife's voice. He did not ask any questions. He immediately left his job, got into his car, and drove as fast as he could back to West Virginia. When he arrived, they quickly packed a few bags with their essential belongings, loaded the children into the car, and drove away. They went straight to Brian's mother's house in Maryland. They never spent another single night in that house. They only returned a few times with large moving trucks and several friends to quickly pack up their furniture and belongings, and they abandoned the property forever. And so, the Kendall family was gone. They had fled the house in the middle of the night, leaving behind their dreams of a quiet country life and a safe place for their children to grow up. But the problem was, they still owned the property. They had invested almost all of their savings into buying that house and land in Slanesville, and now they were stuck paying for a home that they could never set foot in again. Brian had to work even longer hours as a carpenter to cover the mortgage, while they lived crammed in his mother's small home in Maryland. He tried to put the house on the market, but in a tiny community like Slanesville, news travels fast. Word had spread about why the family had fled, and potential buyers were scared off by the dark rumors surrounding the property. People in the area knew the stories of the old occupant and the vigilante group that had taken him out. It turned out that the house became a local legend, a place that teenagers would drive past at night, whispering about the ghost of the child predator and the men who had burned him alive in the woods. But the police department was also forced to look into the matter. After Belinda had spoken to the older woman and heard the story of the murder, she had contacted the local authorities. She told them about the charred van, the children's toys, and the rumors of the vigilante killing that had occurred in the forest behind her former home. The sheriff's deputies and detectives from the state police went out to the property to investigate. They hiked deep into the woods, following the path that Brian and Blair had walked months earlier until they reached the small clearing. And there it was. The rusted, blackened frame of the old van still sitting quietly among the trees. The investigators began a thorough search of the vehicle and the surrounding ground. They brought in forensic teams to examine the charred interior, looking for any trace of human remains that might have survived the intense fire. But the fire had occurred years before, and the harsh West Virginia winters and wet summers had washed away almost all the physical evidence. The metal frame of the van was heavily rusted, and the ash and soot had long since settled into the soil. While they found the melted remains of the toys and the metal springs of the mattress, they could not find any definitive bone fragments or DNA that could be linked to the missing former occupant. The detectives did not stop there. They went into the town of Slanesville and began knocking on doors. They spoke to the longtime residents, the local hunters, and the men who had lived in the area for decades. But the problem was, the people of Slanesville were fiercely protective of their own. The community was highly isolated, and many of the residents had a deep-seated distrust of outside law enforcement. When the investigators asked about the missing man and the rumors of a vigilante ambush, they were met with shrugs, blank stares, and absolute silence. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. People claimed that the previous owner had simply packed up his things and left town one day, and that they had no idea where he had gone. Even when detectives pressed them about the burned van in the woods, the locals claimed they had never seen it and did not know how it got there. Without any physical remains of a body, and with a complete wall of silence from the community, the police were at a complete dead end. They could not prove that a murder had actually taken place, and they certainly could not identify any suspects. The investigation slowly ground to a halt, and the case was shelved as an unresolved missing person investigation. The dark secret of what had actually happened in those woods remained locked away in the minds of the men who had carried out the deed. Fast forward to years later, and the psychological impact on the Kendall family was still incredibly profound. Young Sean, who was only 3 years old when his arm was broken, had to live with the physical memory of that night for the rest of his life. Even though his bones eventually healed and his arm regained its strength, he could never escape the mental image of the monster coming through his bedroom window. He suffered from severe, recurring night terrors that lasted well into his teenage years. He would often wake up screaming, convinced that someone was standing outside his room watching him through the glass. His sister, Blair, was also deeply affected. The memory of pulling back the blackout curtain in the RV and seeing that dark, towering figure staring down at her was burned into her mind. She became hypervigilant about home security. As she grew older, she refused to sleep in rooms that did not have heavy, secure locks on the windows, and she could never sleep without making sure the curtains were pulled completely closed and secured at the edges. Belinda, too, carried a heavy burden of guilt and fear. She spent years wondering if she could have done more to protect her children, and if she had ignored the warning signs for too long. She could not stop thinking about the strange, vivid dreams she had experienced. The dream of the young boy leading her through the maze of white sheets, only to find a real wooden clothespin at the foot of her bed, remained one of the most terrifying mysteries of her life. She often wondered if the spirit of one of the predator's young victims had been trying to warn her about the danger lurking on the property, or if she had somehow tapped into the residual energy of the horrific events that had taken place there. She spent a long time in counseling, trying to process the trauma of living in a house that was built on top of such dark and violent history. Eventually, the family was able to find a sense of peace. They bought a small, cozy home in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Maryland, far away from the deep, isolated forests of West Virginia. The new house had neighbors nearby, streetlights that kept the darkness of night at bay, and a busy, comforting atmosphere. It was the exact opposite of the isolation they had sought in Slanesville, but they realized that the isolation they had once craved was the very thing that had made them so vulnerable. In their new home, they finally felt safe. The kids were able to play outside in a fenced yard, and they eventually got a new family dog, a sweet golden retriever, who brought a sense of joy and security back into their lives. But they never forgot Coco, the brave black lab who had stood over Blair in the RV, baring her teeth to protect her from the dark figure outside. They always believed that Coco had been stolen by the same local men who wanted to keep the secrets of the property hidden, or perhaps by someone who wanted to remove the family's only line of defense. The loss of Coco remained a painful, lingering wound for the entire family. The house in Slanesville eventually fell into a state of complete neglect. Because the family could not sell it and refused to ever return, the forest slowly began to reclaim the property. The wooden siding of the ranch-style home began to rot, the roof started to sag under the weight of fallen leaves and heavy winter snows, and weeds and wild brush grew tall, swallowing up the front yard where Belinda had dreamed of clotheslines and white sheets. The long gravel driveway became overgrown with saplings, making the house almost entirely inaccessible to vehicles. The tiny, unmarked cemetery with the 4 child-sized headstones remained hidden in the deep shadows of the trees, a quiet, forgotten resting place for the victims of a horror that the community had chosen to bury in silence. And deep in the woods, the rusted, charred frame of the van continued to sit, slowly sinking into the forest floor, a silent witness to a brutal act of vigilante justice that had sought to end one nightmare, only to leave a haunting, permanent scar on the land. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a strange part of human nature that makes us want to go exactly where we are told not to go. When we see a high fence, a locked gate, or a warning sign that says keep out, something inside of us gets incredibly curious. We start to wonder, what is on the other side? Is it a beautiful view, a hidden secret, or something dangerous? For most of us, we look at the warning signs, we feel that little spark of curiosity, and then we turn around and walk away. We follow the rules because we know those rules are usually there to keep us safe. But some people cannot resist the temptation. They see the boundary as a challenge. They decide to step over the line, to push past the warnings, and to explore the forbidden zones. Today we are going to look at 3 stories of people who did exactly that. They went into places that were completely off limits, and they ended up facing consequences that were far more terrifying than any warning sign could ever describe. Our first story takes us to the beautiful island of Oahu in Hawaii. It was February 27th, 2015. An 18-year-old native Hawaiian named Dallin Pua was visiting his grandmother. Dallin was an energetic young man who loved the outdoors. Even though he was native to Hawaii, he had not spent a lot of time on Oahu, so this trip was a special occasion. He wanted to make the most of his time there, and there was one specific adventure that he had been dreaming about for years. He wanted to climb the famous Haiku Stairs, which are also known to locals as the Stairway to Heaven. Now, the Stairway to Heaven is not your typical hiking trail. It is a highly dangerous, extremely narrow, and completely illegal pathway that climbs up the side of a massive mountain. The trail consists of nearly 4,000 steel steps that are bolted directly into the steep cliffs. It was originally built during World War II by the United States Navy so they could gain access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and poorly maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987. They literally put up a fence and put guards out to keep people from going in, and they handed out massive fines to anyone caught trespassing, but Dallin really wanted to do this. That morning, he told his grandmother that he was thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. His grandmother immediately got worried. She told him that it was a horrible idea, explaining how dangerous the crumbling stairs were and warning him that he would be fined thousands of dollars if he got caught. Dallin backed down and told her that he would not go, playing it off like he had changed his mind. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal, he was so excited about the hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. The first photo he posted showed him standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the massive mountain towering above him. He added a caption about how excited he was to finally start the hike. Over the next few hours, Dalen climbed higher and higher into the clouds. He kept taking photos and posting them online for his friends and family to see. Each picture showed the stunning dramatic drops on either side of the narrow metal stairs. He looked happy, full of energy, and completely fine. And then he kept climbing, taking more pictures as the stairs became steeper and more treacherous. But then, right around 11 o'clock that morning, the posting stopped abruptly. He had not reached the summit yet. You figure if you are going to do this hike and you are already posting pictures of the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you are going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post those because that is the prize at the end. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly had not reached the summit yet. By that night, when he did not come home, his family was really concerned and they notified the police. The police launched a huge search for him, looking all over the stairs. They had helicopters out and even the Navy got involved, but there was absolutely no sign of him. He had just vanished. When they could not find him after several days, they had to call the search off. The assumption was that he simply slipped at some point and fell down the mountain, which is exactly why the stairs are off limits and not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something chilling. One shot looked like he was just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down in the bushes a little ways down the trail who appears to be hiding. Many people believe that this man was following Dalen and at some point attacked him. They believe Dalen did not fall off the mountain, but was instead abducted or killed. To this day, Dalen has never been found, and that mystery man has never been identified. Now, let us travel to the most remote island in the world, which is Bouvet Island. It is an uninhabited 19 square mile chunk of rock and ice situated in the South Atlantic. If you were looking on a map and drew a 1,000-mile radius around Bouvet Island, there would be absolutely nothing else inside of it. There is no land, there is nothing. In fact, the nearest land is 1,100 miles away, and that is Antarctica, which is not permanently inhabited. The nearest permanently inhabited land is South Africa, and that is 1,600 miles away. The island is so far away from anything that in 1979, Israel and South Africa dropped 2 nuclear bombs near it, and nobody noticed. The only reason anyone found out is because a United States satellite happened to be looking in its direction and saw 2 bright flashes of light. For the very few people who have ever gone to Bouvet Island, you cannot just take a ship there because all around the edges of this island are these jagged ice cliffs and the water is treacherous. If you were to fall in, you would get sucked up underneath the rocks and you would be done for. So, nearly anyone who has stepped foot on Bouvet Island has taken a helicopter, which is a long, sketchy flight. Anyone who has been on the island only stays for a few minutes because they are worried about a storm rolling in, and the weather there is famously bad. Oh, and Bouvet Island is also an active volcano. It is a horrible place where nobody should go, but a few people still do. In 1964, British explorer Alan Crawford was sent out to Bouvet Island with a team of scientists to inspect the northwest corner of the island where a recent lava flow had created a flat shelf. The British wanted to build a weather station there, but they needed someone to go out and give the green light. On April 2nd, 1964, Crawford and his crew departed South Africa and began the long helicopter ride. When they finally touched down, everybody was on edge because they were in the most remote place in the world. The team immediately got to work surveying the site, while Crawford decided to step over the ridge for just a couple of minutes to look out at the island. He was fascinated with Bouvet Island and wanted to get a better look at it. He walked up this embankment and crested the hill, and as he looked down, he saw a little rocky alcove where there was a bit of a beach. And sitting in the shallow waters of this lagoon, he saw a wooden lifeboat that was half sunken. He could not believe it because he knew it was not theirs, and he was thinking how a boat could have gotten here at all when the nearest land was 1,100 miles away. He started walking down towards the beach and saw two wooden oars that went with the boat. Next to them was a flattened copper tank used to catch water, and next to that was a wooden barrel which would have been used to store water. He looked around for other signs of human life, but there were none. There was no tent, no clothes, and no human remains. He got down to the beach and waded into the water to inspect the lifeboat. He looked for identifying marks or numbers, but there were none. Because Crawford knew they had very little time, he ran back on shore, took a quick photo of the lifeboat with his camera, and then returned to his team. He told them what he had found, but his team was so focused on getting the survey done and getting out of there that they did not really care. They said it probably just washed up from some shipwreck and told him to forget about it. Crawford flew back to South Africa, showed the photo to his superiors, but they did not care either. 2 years later, another crew was sent to survey that same lagoon, but when they arrived, there was no boat, no barrel, no copper tank, and no oars. It was as if it was never there. We still do not know who was on that boat, how they got there, or where they went. In central Texas lies a stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It is this beautiful, crystal-clear water spring that people love to visit every summer when the weather gets hot in Texas. People converge on Jacob's Well to enjoy swimming in the refreshing water, but it is not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It is also for daredevils who strap scuba gear on and dive down through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 distinct chambers, and as you move from one chamber to the next, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces. Each of the chambers gets smaller and darker because you are losing sunlight, making them overall much more difficult to navigate. If you put on your scuba gear and hop into Jacob's Well, you swim straight down and reach the first chamber, which sits between 30 and 55 feet deep. In this first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there is algae and wildlife, and this is where rookie scuba divers spend their time. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it is much narrower, and this tunnel actually makes up the second chamber, bringing you down to 80 feet deep. Any diver in the second chamber has to be extremely aware of their surroundings on their ascent so they do not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is an opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber, but it is a complete dead end. It loops around before hitting a solid rock wall, forcing you to go all the way back out, assuming you have enough air. The second chamber attracts intermediate divers, but it is very tight and claustrophobic. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your air tanks on. This brings you into a small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there is loose silt and gravel on the floor. If your fin so much as knocks it, the silt will float into the water and completely blind you. Generally speaking, only expert divers ever go into this third chamber. At the bottom of this chamber is a heavy metal grate that sits over a tiny little opening, which is the entrance to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it actually looks like inside the fourth chamber, because once you go in, it is impossible not to kick up a ton of silt, meaning you are going in blind. Furthermore, anyone who has successfully entered the fourth chamber has died there. There are literally deceased divers inside of the fourth chamber, and after about a dozen people died trying to get in there, they finally sealed it up with that heavy grate. But to go in, you have to remove your air tanks, push them ahead of you through the hole, and then slowly wriggle your way in while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth. In 1983, two 24-year-old college students named Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 in the evening. They were both highly experienced advanced scuba divers who had dived Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water, went through the first chamber, continued into the second chamber, wriggled into the third chamber, and reached the grate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open the heavy grate. Richard Patton was the first one to go in. He removed his tanks, pushed them inside the opening, and began headfirst to slither inside the fourth chamber. Clark waited outside in the third chamber. But as soon as Richard made it inside, things went terribly wrong. Clark would later state that as soon as Richard got into the chamber, he came screaming back out of the opening. Clark realized that Richard did not have his mouthpiece in and did not have his scuba tanks on. He had dropped his gear in the pitch blackness and was desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold. Richard was reaching for Clark to pull him through the hole. As soon as Richard got free, Clark took his own mouthpiece off and jammed it into Richard's mouth. They began buddy breathing, sharing the single regulator back and forth as they made their way back up, leaving the lost equipment behind. They made it back into the third chamber and then into the second chamber, kicking desperately to reach the surface. But in their panic, their heads suddenly hit solid rock, and they realized they had gone up the false chimney. What was even worse was that they heard the empty hiss of their tank, meaning they were completely out of air. Clark, who had taken a full breath before the air ran out, turned and managed to swim out of the false chimney and make it to the surface before drowning. But Richard was not as lucky. His final moments were spent in total darkness, with the silt kicked up all around him with no air and no idea where to go. He desperately tried to swim up, but kept hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. When we look back at these three cases, we are left with a profound sense of mystery and a deep appreciation for the boundaries that exist in our world. It is easy to look at warning signs, fences, and closed gates as mere inconveniences designed to restrict our freedom, but the reality is much more sobering. These boundaries are often written in the history of tragic lessons learned by those who came before us. The lore of the forbidden is a powerful force in human psychology, drawing us toward the edges of the map and the depths of the unknown, but nature is completely indifferent to our curiosity. In the case of Dalen Pua, an ordinary trip to visit his grandmother turned into a parent's worst nightmare, leaving a family with a permanent void and a haunting question that may never be answered. Was Dalen simply a victim of the treacherous, crumbling steps of the Haiku Stairs, or did he cross paths with a predator who was using the illegal trail as a hunting ground? The image of the crouched figure in the bushes remains a chilling reminder that when we step off the beaten path, we leave behind the safety of society and enter a world where we are completely vulnerable. On Bouvet Island, the mystery of the abandoned lifeboat challenges our understanding of human survival. Who were the people who rowed a simple wooden boat across thousands of miles of the most hostile ocean on Earth only to land on a freezing volcanic rock? How did they manage to survive, and where did they go when the boat vanished? The complete lack of human remains or personal belongings on that icy beach suggests a story of quiet desperation, a struggle against the elements that was ultimately swallowed by the freezing wind and snow, leaving behind only a single photograph as proof that they were ever there. And at Jacob's Well, the tragic fate of Richard Patton shows us how quickly an exciting adventure can turn into a deadly trap. The false chimney stands as a physical manifestation of our worst fears, an illusion that promises safety but delivers only darkness and confinement. For the survivors, the guilt and the memories of those final desperate moments under the water are a heavy burden to carry, a constant reminder of how a single wrong turn in the dark can make the difference between life and death. Ultimately, these stories remind us to respect the limits of our own endurance and the rules that protect us, because once we step across that line into the forbidden, we are entirely on our own, and the earth does not always let us return. It makes you realize that sometimes the signs are there for a reason, and some secrets are simply meant to stay buried in the quiet, dark places where humans were never meant to go. And the scariest part is every single one of these people thought they would make it back. If you're not ready to sleep yet, there are more true mysteries waiting in the next video. On the 2nd of August 1963, the Pankman family was filled with the kind of simple excitement that marks the beginning of a summer adventure. The family, a tight-knit group of 5, packed up their car and headed off to a camping resort nestled by the serene, deep lake in Washington state. There was Mr. and Mrs. Pankman and their 3 sons. 10-year-old Bill, the responsible older brother, 6-year-old Jimmy, full of energy and curiosity. And then there was 4-year-old Bobby, the youngest, who was going through a classic toddler phase of refusing to wear shoes. For him, the feel of the earth beneath his feet was a freedom he wasn't willing to give up. The first day at the campsite was perfect. They settled in, the boys explored the immediate area around their tent, and the parents, Edna and her husband, relaxed, happy to be away from the daily routine. The following day, August 3rd, started out just as promising. After breakfast, Edna had an idea. She had heard from other campers about a logging road just behind their campsite. It was supposed to lead to a beautiful little waterfall, a hidden gem she thought her boys would absolutely love to see. It sounded like the perfect little morning excursion. So, Edna got the boys ready. She told her husband she was taking them for a short walk to see the waterfall and that they wouldn't be long. He waved them off, and Edna, with Bill, Jimmy, and shoeless little Bobby, started down the path. As soon as they stepped onto the logging road, however, Edna realized the descriptions might have been a bit romanticized. The road was completely overgrown. The grass was tall, tickling their legs as they walked. The ground was uneven, a mix of rocks and bumpy dirt that had been reclaimed by nature. It was immediately clear to her that no vehicle had driven down this road in a very, very long time. This wasn't just a quiet spot. It was truly isolated. The thought was a little unsettling, but also part of the appeal of being out in the wilderness. They continued their walk, the boys chattering, enjoying the adventure of the untamed path. After a little while, they spotted a small turnoff, a less defined path that seemed to lead down towards the sound of water. This had to be the way to the waterfall. But as they got closer, Edna saw that the path was choked with thick brush, and the ground looked even rougher than the road had been. This was going to be a problem for Bobby. His bare feet had been fine on the packed dirt of the road, but this terrain of sharp sticks and rocks was too much for a 4-year-old. Edna made a quick decision. She turned to her youngest son and said, "Bobby, you need to wait here on the road for a minute." She then looked at 6-year-old Jimmy. "You stay with him. Keep him company." The plan was simple. She and Bill, the oldest, would push through the brush, go down to the water, and quickly check out the waterfall. It would only take a couple of minutes. Then she'd come right back, pick up Bobby, and they could all go down together. Bobby didn't seem to mind at all. He just sat down on the relatively clear patch of the road, perfectly content. Jimmy, on the other hand, was a little frustrated. He wanted to be in the first group, to see the waterfall with his big brother and his mom. But he did as he was told and sat down next to Bobby. And so, Edna and Bill pushed past the thicket of brush and made their way down the short slope to the water's edge. Now, it's important to understand the layout here. The distance between where Edna and Bill stood by the waterfall and where Bobby and Jimmy sat on the road was only about 10 feet. It was an incredibly short distance. The only thing separating them was that dense patch of brush, which did completely obscure their view of each other. They couldn't see the boys, and the boys couldn't see them. But they were so close, they could have easily heard a shout, a cry, or any unusual noise. As Edna and Bill looked at the small cascade of water, Jimmy was sitting next to his little brother, getting more and more restless by the second. He could hear the water, he could hear his mom and brother talking, and he just couldn't stand being left out. The wait felt like an eternity to a 6-year-old. At some point, his patience just ran out. He couldn't take it anymore. And in that moment, Jimmy made a choice that he would carry with him a heavy weight of regret for the rest of his life. He stood up and he left his little brother sitting there all alone. Jimmy scrambled through the brush, emerging by the water where his mom and Bill were. As soon as Edna saw him, she was annoyed. She looked at him sternly and said, "What are you doing? You left Bobby up there all by himself. Come on." She didn't waste another second. They had only been down by the water for about 60 seconds in total. A single minute. She turned right around, with Bill and Jimmy in tow, and they all pushed back through the brush and up onto the road. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. At first, there was no real alarm. The immediate thought wasn't that something terrible had happened. It couldn't have. They were in the middle of nowhere. They hadn't seen another person all morning. They hadn't heard a single sound other than their own voices and the birds. Edna's first reaction was simple annoyance, mostly directed at Jimmy for not staying put. She assumed Bobby had gotten up to wander. Maybe he was hiding behind a tree, playing a little game. Or perhaps he'd just walked a few feet down the hill. So they started calling for him. "Bobby? Where are you?" They walked around the immediate area, peering behind trees and into the tall grass. No one was panicking yet. It was just an inconvenience, a brief delay in their morning walk. But after a couple of minutes of calling his name with no response, a small seed of worry began to sprout. Bobby wasn't answering. They couldn't see him anywhere. The annoyance started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Edna began to feel a knot tightening in her stomach. She started yelling louder, her voice now edged with panic. She sent Bill and Jimmy to look down by the water again to check every possible spot, but there was absolutely no trace of him. It just didn't make any sense. He was 4 years old. He had no shoes on. He couldn't have gone far in such a short amount of time. And how could he have disappeared without them hearing anything? He was just gone. The panic was now in full bloom. After a few more frantic minutes of searching the same small area over and over, Edna knew this was a situation she couldn't handle on her own. She gathered her other two boys, their faces pale with confusion and fear, and they ran. They ran as fast as they could all the way back down the overgrown logging road to the campsite. They burst into the camp, and Edna frantically explained to her husband what had happened. They immediately got help and called the police. Very quickly, a massive search operation was launched on that lonely logging road. When the police arrived, the first thing they did was sit down with Edna, Bill, and Jimmy. They pressed them, gently but firmly, about what they had heard. "You had to have heard something," the officers explained. "He was only 10 feet away from you. He was definitely within earshot. Did you hear a car? An animal? Did you hear anyone talking? Anything at all?" But Edna and the boys could only shake their heads, their expressions a mixture of bafflement and terror. They swore up and down that they had heard nothing. The woods had been completely silent. They were just as confused as anyone else. This left the police with a very difficult starting point. They had no idea where Bobby could have gone. They carefully surveyed the area. There were no steep cliffs or drop-offs nearby. No obvious places a small child could have fallen into or become trapped. The waterfall itself fed into a tiny, shallow brook. It would be difficult for anyone, let alone a 4-year-old, to drown in it. With no clues to go on, the searchers had no choice but to simply fan out in all directions, a combing operation through the dense woods, hoping to find a piece of clothing, a footprint, or any other sign that would tell them which way he went. For 3 long, agonizing days, hundreds of searchers scoured the forest. They found nothing. Finally, they decided to bring in a bloodhound to try and track Bobby by his scent. They brought one of Bobby's shoes from the campsite for the dog to smell. The moment the dog was given the scent, it seemed to lock on immediately. It got very excited, its nose to the ground, and started pulling the handler right near the area where Bobby had last been seen. Then the dog turned and started running up the logging road away from the campsite deeper into the forest. It ran for nearly 2 miles, never seeming to lose the scent. It was clearly and confidently tracking Bobby. The dog finally stopped at a fork in the road, about 2 miles from where Bobby had disappeared. It keyed in on one specific area right at the fork. It was just a bare patch of dirt. There was nothing significant about it at all. The police were hopeful. They dug into the dirt a little, but there was nothing there. They scanned the entire area looking for any sign that Bobby had been there, but there was nothing. No footprints, no discarded items. They brought the dog back a little way and gave it the scent again. And again, the dog went right back to that exact same patch of dirt at the fork in the road and refused to move on. The dog was certain the trail ended there, but the investigators didn't know what to do with that information. It was a dead end with no explanation. After 7 days of exhaustive searching that yielded absolutely nothing, the search for Bobby Pankman was officially called off. The lead investigator held a press conference. His face was grim as he told the reporters that they had no idea what had happened to Bobby. However, he stated that they did believe he was abducted. His reasoning was straightforward and logical. Bobby was a very young child with no shoes on, in a forest he didn't know. He was out of his mother's sight for, at most, 2 minutes. How far could he have really gotten on his own in that time? Certainly not far enough that his family and a massive search party wouldn't have found him. But if you go down the abduction theory, you run into a whole new set of problems. For a person to have taken Bobby, that person had to be on that extremely isolated, overgrown logging road at that exact moment. The Pankmans hadn't seen anyone else the entire time they were there. And there were very few other campers at the resort. This suggests that if a person did abduct Bobby, they must have been planning it. They would have had Ohat been hiding in the trees, stalking the family, waiting for an opportunity. And then you have to consider the opportunity itself. It was a tiny 2-minute window that opened up completely by chance when Jimmy decided to leave his brother's side. It wasn't an obvious moment. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which you would think would have been a deterrent to any would-be kidnapper. But as soon as that window presented itself, this person would have had to run out from the tree line, run over to Bobby, pick him up without Bobby making a single sound, muffle him somehow, and then run away back into the woods carrying a child, all within that 2-minute time frame. It just seemed like the person who could do that would need to be incredibly fixated on Bobby specifically, and there was no reason for anyone to be. And 2, they would need to be extraordinarily strong, fast, and agile. We're talking about someone with the physical fitness of a professional athlete. While it's certainly possible that a highly athletic individual had been stalking this family and executed a flawless, silent abduction in a tiny window of opportunity and then evaded a massive search for 7 days in the woods, it just seemed incredibly unlikely. Investigators reached this same conclusion. They thought the human abduction theory, while the most likely, was still full of holes. So they moved on to considering animals. Maybe a bear had taken Bobby. They brought in specialized bear-sniffing dogs to search the area for any signs of recent bear activity. The dogs found nothing. So they moved on. Okay, maybe it was a cougar. They brought in a cougar expert to examine the area. The expert found no tracks, no scat, no signs of a cougar anywhere nearby. Plus, a key piece of evidence was missing facing a large predator attack. There was no blood anywhere, and there were no drag marks in the dirt. If a predator were to grab a child, it would have to drag them away, and that would leave a very clear trail. There was none. With the large predator theory also seeming unlikely, someone offered up another idea. Maybe a giant eagle had swooped down, picked Bobby up, and flown away with him. This would account for the silence, the lack of drag marks, and the lack of blood. It would explain why he just vanished. But that was the point when authorities knew they were grasping at straws. They had no clue what had happened. And that's why the investigator at the press release basically said, "We just don't know." And so while we will probably never know for sure what happened to 4-year-old Bobby Pankman, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent. It was fast, strong, and agile. And it had been watching that family because as soon as that 2-minute window of vulnerability presented itself, it swept in so fast and so silently that no one saw it, no one heard it, and it took Bobby somewhere. And whatever it did to him, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormack Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. He was the kind of man who couldn't sit still for long. He was feeling bored and restless and decided he wanted to do something fun with his 16-year-old son, James McCormack Jr. The two of them were very close and shared a love for the outdoors. They were both avid and experienced hunters. So they settled on going hunting together. They chose Larch Mountain as their destination. Even though it was only about 30 miles from the city, Larch Mountain had a reputation. It was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the entire northwestern United States. On December 4th, the two men, along with their loyal hunting dog, headed out. They arrived at the base of the mountain, excited for the day ahead. They hopped out of their car, put on their gear, and began their hike into the vast wilderness. The weather forecasters had predicted a cold day with a chance of some light snow, but overall, the weather was supposed to hold. It was just supposed to be a day trip. They planned to be back home by nightfall, so they hadn't brought any equipment for an overnight stay. They had warm clothes, some food, and water, but no tent or shelter. After walking for several hours deep into the mountains, they started to notice a dramatic shift in the weather. The temperature was dropping rapidly, much faster than they had anticipated. Then, a light rain began to fall. And then, within a very short period of time, that rain turned into heavy, wet snow. Initially, they thought they could gut it out. They were tough guys, and they didn't want a little bad weather to ruin their trip. But soon, the snow was coming down so hard and their gear was getting so wet that they decided it was time to call it a day. It was awful, and it was going to get dark soon. So they agreed to turn around and head back to the truck. They could always go hunting another day. But the snow had come on so quickly and was so thick that when they turned around to retrace their steps, the landscape looked completely different. Everything was covered in a fresh, white blanket that disguised all the landmarks they had been using. They didn't have a GPS, of course. They were navigating with a map and compass. And they weren't on a marked trail. They had been bushwhacking, just walking through the mountains looking for a good spot to set up. So they started walking in the direction they believed was back to their vehicle. They made turns they thought were correct, but they soon started to question where they were. After walking for several more hours, they realized they weren't anywhere near a road. They were in an area they didn't recognize at all. And the sinking feeling hit them. They were lost. By this point, it was snowing really hard, and the liquid of the daylight was fading. The pair decided they had no choice. They had to spend the night out in the wilderness. They weren't going to find their vehicle in the dark, especially now. Their best bet was to find a place to camp out for the night and try again in the morning. But remember, they had no tent, no sleeping bags, nothing to protect them from the elements. They decided their best option was to climb up into a large tree. At least that way, they would be off the frozen ground. It would offer some protection from potential predators, and the thick branches of the evergreen would shield them a little bit from the relentless snow and freezing rain. That night was a sleepless, miserable ordeal. James Sr., James Jr., and their dog huddled together in that tree, shivering uncontrollably as they were just destroyed by the storm. The snow and freezing rain never let up, and the wind howled through the branches. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sun came up the next morning. It brought a glimmer of hope, although it was still absolutely dumping snow on them. They were cold and exhausted, but they were still optimistic. They were thinking to themselves, this is going to make one heck of a story when we finally get back home. And so they carefully climbed out of the tree, their limbs stiff and sore. They stretched, trying to get some feeling back into their bodies, and then they began walking again in a direction they hoped would lead them to their vehicle. For several hours, they just trudged through the deep snow, hoping to stumble upon the road. But they didn't. At some point, they stopped, and the reality of their situation hit them once again. They were in the exact same position as the day before. They still had no idea where they were, and now they had potentially walked even farther in the wrong direction. James Sr. pulled out his map, trying to make sense of their location. He was looking at the terrain around them, trying to match it to the contours on the map, looking for any clue about which way they should be going. As he was doing this, his son, who had been a really tough kid up to this point and hadn't complained about anything, said to his dad that he was feeling delirious. He said he felt like he couldn't think straight and that it was even hard for him to stand. He was going to sit down for a minute. At first, his dad wasn't overly concerned. They had just spent a miserable night in a tree. It made sense that his son would be tired and feeling out of it. And they had been well rested before the trip. They had only been out in the elements for one full day. They still had warm clothes, food, and water. He figured his son would just sit down for a minute, catch his breath, and then he'd be rejuvenated and ready to keep moving. So, James Sr. continued to study his map, looking around, waiting for his son to say he was ready to go. But his son just continued to deteriorate. He started speaking in nonsense, and he couldn't get up on his own. This was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel a deep, cold fear for their actual safety. Even the night before, huddled in the tree, it had just felt like a crazy adventure that they would eventually overcome. Even that morning when they woke up and it was still snowing and they were still lost, he had held on to that optimism, and so had his son. But now, he was thinking that they were potentially staring down another night out in the storm. They were going to eventually run out of food and water. Their clothes were getting soaked through. The temperatures were dropping well below freezing. And now, something was seriously wrong with his son. This was concerning on its own, but it also meant that if his son couldn't move, they couldn't make any progress towards getting out of this situation. James Sr. was a very fit man. As a fireman, he was used to physically demanding situations. He looked at his son and said, "Okay, I'm going to pick you up, and I'm going to carry you." He hoisted his son up in a fireman's carry, draping him over his shoulders. And for 3 solid hours, James Sr. just continued to march through the deep snow, carrying his son, desperately looking for the way out. After 3 hours, when they had not gotten any closer to a road or any sign of civilization, and it was now getting dark again, he finally collapsed from exhaustion. He gently put his son down by a tree and sat down next to him, totally defeated. He told his son they had to get ready for another night. They had to get back up in a tree and do it all over again. As they were sitting there, talking about how they were going to get James Jr. up into a tree, since he was now too weak to climb up himself, they both noticed something strange. About 100 feet in front of them, there were 2 very bright lights that looked exactly like headlights. James Sr.'s heart leaped. "Oh my goodness, what luck," he thought. "There's a road right there that we just didn't see, and there's a car parked on it." He turned to his son and said, "I'm going to go up and talk to them, tell them we're stuck out here, and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here, I'll be right back." So, James Sr. got up and started running towards those lights. They were his lifeline. He wanted to get to them before the car potentially pulled away, not realizing there were 2 people in desperate need of help just a few yards away. As he was running, covering 50, 60, 70 feet, he noticed the lights seemed to be moving farther and farther away from him. James Sr. stopped in his tracks. He stood there, panting, looking at these lights and thinking, are those really headlights? What are those lights? And then, at some point, the lights just seemed to drift off into the forest, and then they were gone. James Sr. looked around and realized there was no road over there. He was still in the middle of the deep woods. What were those lights? He stood there for a minute, a wave of confusion and fear washing over him. Was he losing his grip on reality? What was going on? He turned around and started running back to where he had left his son and his dog. But when he got there, only his dog was there. His son was gone. What was going through James Sr.'s mind was, how is this possible? His son couldn't even walk just a few minutes ago. He certainly wouldn't have lied to him and made him carry him all this way. There was just enough light left from the dusk and the reflection off the snow that he could still see footprints on the ground. He saw the backpack his son had left by the tree. He grabbed it, he grabbed his dog, and he started yelling for his son at the top of his lungs. And he started following the single set of footprints that led away from the tree, the footprints that had to have been left by his son. He's walking along these tracks, yelling his son's name, but he's hearing nothing back. And this whole time, he's thinking to himself, why would he even leave? Even if he suddenly could move, why would he leave me? We're in this together. What is going on with my son? He kept walking, following the tracks, but the snow was still coming down so heavily that the prints were getting harder and harder to see. They were filling in with fresh snow almost as fast as he could follow them. Finally, it got completely dark, and he couldn't see the prints at all anymore. Now, James Sr. was absolutely panicked. This was a complete nightmare. Where was his son? What were those strange lights? And now he was facing another night out here, all alone. He just picked a random direction, holding on to his son's belongings with his dog by his side, and he just started running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog stumbled into a lodge. It was about 6 miles away, as the crow flies, from where they had originally parked their car at Larch Mountain. Of course, that doesn't mean they only traveled 6 miles. They had likely zigzagged all over the mountain, covering a much greater distance. It was a miracle that he had found it. He had basically run all night until he hit a road, and then he followed that road until it led him to this lodge. He stumbled inside, hypothermic and exhausted, and told the staff that his son was missing. He told them they had been lost for 2 days, and his son was out there in the middle of the woods, hurt, and they needed to go find him. Very quickly, the police were called. Word spread to the fire department in Portland that the fire inspector's son was missing. In an incredible show of solidarity, 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain to help with the search. The paramedics at the lodge wanted James Sr. to go straight to the hospital. He was in bad shape. But he was not about to leave his son. He refused all medical attention and insisted on going out with the very first group of searchers. Somehow, in his exhausted and disoriented state, he was able to lead them back to the rough area where his son had been sitting when he disappeared. They began to search that area, and very quickly they found James Jr.'s glasses case. A little farther on, they found his boots and his socks just sitting in the snow. But there was no sign of James Jr. himself. Later that day, though, they would find him. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and glasses case were found. He was at the bottom of a cliff, and he was deceased. Initially, the searchers thought the story was straightforward. He must have gotten confused, wandered away from where his dad told him to sit, and tragically fallen off the cliff. But the medical examiner determined that he did not die from the fall. The evidence showed he had made his way down to the base of that cliff and then died of exposure. This left everyone with a series of baffling questions. How was James Jr. suddenly able to walk again after being so weak he had to be carried? And once he regained that ability, why didn't he go towards his dad or call out for him? Why did he walk away from him? And perhaps most strangely, why did he take his shoes and socks off in a blizzard to do it? And what were those mysterious lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? They weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that his son suddenly got up and walked away into the storm. In early July of 1953, the Huggen family was preparing for a long-awaited summer vacation. Mr. and Mrs. Huggen, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week retreat. They were heading to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario. This wasn't a bustling tourist town. Wade was, and still is, one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was situated right in the middle of a huge swampy forest, and it wasn't far from one of the biggest lakes in the area, a body of water called Fox Lake. The family arrived late in the evening on July 4th. After the long drive, they were too tired to do much of anything. They just unpacked the essentials, got the girls settled, and went to bed, dreaming of the weeks of relaxation and adventure ahead. Early the next morning, the adults in the cabin decided they wanted to take the girls down to Fox Lake for the day. So they began the busy process of gathering all the supplies they would need, towels, snacks, fishing gear, and everything else for a full day by the water. While the adults were busy packing, the 3 girls were allowed to play outside the cabin. It was a completely safe environment, or so they thought. There were no neighbors for miles around. The cabin was an isolated outpost in the wilderness. It was totally normal to let the children play by themselves just outside the door. They weren't concerned about someone taking them. The 2 older girls played together in the front yard of the cabin. 5-year-old Geraldine, the youngest, was playing by herself on the side of the cabin. This meant the 2 girls in the front couldn't see Geraldine, and she couldn't see them. The adults were keeping a general eye on all 3 girls. They were mostly going in and out of the cabin, grabbing things for their trip, and they would periodically poke their heads out the windows or the door to check on them. And every time they looked, the girls were fine, happily playing in the morning sun. At around 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car. They were ready to go. They went outside to collect the girls to head over to the lake. They gathered the 2 older girls who were playing out front, and then they walked around to the side of the house to get Geraldine. But they couldn't find her. At this initial moment, they weren't worried. She was a 5-year-old. Where could she have possibly gone? They walked around the entire house, calling her name. Geraldine? They asked the 2 older girls if they had seen her, where she had gone. And they just said they didn't know, that she was just playing on the side of the house a minute ago. When they couldn't find her outside, they went back into the cabin, thinking she must have slipped inside without them noticing. That seemed to be the only other place she could possibly be. But after a thorough search of the small cabin, looking under beds and in closets, and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults started talking to each other, trying to establish a timeline. Did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her recently? And they all said yes. They had all poked their heads out a window or a door at some point and had seen her playing right on the side of the cabin within the last 10 minutes. They all agreed on this. In the last 10 minutes, she was right there. So now they were alarmed. They couldn't find her, but they were still thinking they were going to find her any second. They went back outside and began looking around again, this time yelling for her with more urgency. Now, this was such a remote section of Ontario that there was virtually no noise pollution. Sound travels incredibly well out there. When they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. Even if Geraldine had sprinted as fast as her little legs could carry her for 10 solid minutes away from the cabin, she still would have been easily within earshot. All she had to do was yell back, and they would have heard her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. At this point, the family was panicking. They called the police. When the police showed up, they took one look at the vast, dense wilderness surrounding the cabin and knew they were going to need a lot more help. They weren't going to be able to search this area effectively on their own. This was a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. So they called in some professional trackers, local men who were intimately familiar with this rugged terrain, to come and help them. They also called the army base in Winnipeg to send over some soldiers to assist in the search as well. But just as the search was getting organized and underway, the skies opened up. A torrential downpour began, dumping rain all over the entire area. It basically washed away any footprints or tracks that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set, there was still no sign of Geraldine. Her father, his heart breaking, said something to the searchers that was intended to help them, but it was just an incredibly sad comment. He told them that his daughter was terrified of the dark, and that once it got dark out in these woods, she would be too scared to move. She would just sit down and cry. He was hoping this meant she wouldn't wander farther away and that they would be able to find her. But they didn't find her that night. For 3 days, they looked everywhere for her. Hundreds of people combed the woods. There was no trace of her at all. And to make matters even worse, the weather had turned really rainy and cold. The temperatures weren't below freezing, but they were close, down in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And Geraldine was only wearing a light shirt and shorts. She was not prepared for this kind of weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they finally found a clue. They found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's. They were high up on a mossy ledge that overlooked Fox Lake. The footprints indicated that a small child, probably Geraldine, had stood there looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swampy area below. Her footprints then dissipated into the muck and water of the swamp. So, the entire search effort was now focused on the swamp. They had thousands of people combing through this mosquito-infested, dense bush looking for the little girl. And once again, they found nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search, they found another set of footprints in the swamp near the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints. These were huge prints. If it was a human print, it would have to belong to an enormous human being. Or the prints belonged to some kind of enormous animal. But they were unable to determine what kind of animal it was. At this point, although there was no real evidence connecting that strange print to Geraldine, people were starting to suspect that whoever or whatever left this print had something to do with her disappearance. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine had gone missing, some of the professional trackers made another discovery. They were 2.5 miles away from where that large print had been found in the swamp, and where Geraldine's own footprints had been found on the ledge. On the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake, they found a small piece of her plaid shirt snagged on a bush. And so they moved the entire search effort over to that section of Long Lake. And within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of her. From what remained, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. The initial thought was that she must have been attacked by wolves, and that's what killed her. But upon a closer inspection of her remains, they saw that her clothing had not been torn, and there was no blood on her clothes. This suggested that the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was already deceased. A wolf attack would have shredded the clothes, and there would be obvious marks indicating an attack. But here, it seemed the animals had picked around the clothing. Geraldine's remains also appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to the spot where she was ultimately located. So, the investigators followed the drag line into this meadow. It led them to a clearing where all the grass had been matted down in a large oval shape. Investigators said it looked like something very big had been lying there. They speculated that this might have been the area where Geraldine had actually been killed, and that afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was eventually found. And so the investigators are thinking, we found that huge unidentified footprint in the swamp on the 7th day, in the same general area where we had found Geraldine's own footprint. We thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large impression, what appears to be a body print from something huge in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so, it seems probable that whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this impression here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left the investigators with two theories, and neither of them really made any sense. The first one was that these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belonged to an enormous person, a giant of a man, who ran up to the cabin in broad daylight, silently abducted Geraldine, and ran off into the woods without anyone seeing or hearing them. And then, for weeks, this giant person managed to totally evade capture, despite, again, being an enormous person lumbering through the forest. That just seemed really unlikely. One, the place giant person even existed, and two, that if they did exist, how could they not get caught? They would be so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory. This makes a little more sense on the surface, because there are enormous predators in the wild that have on rare occasions attacked humans. So that does happen. But when the experts looked at her remains, they had already ruled out a wolf attack. And really, they had ruled out all known animal attacks based on the state of her clothing. So if this was some enormous, unknown predator, how did it kill Geraldine without leaving a trace on her clothes? The family was told that, unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they were unable to determine an official cause of death. Their best guess, they told the family, was that she was probably mauled by wild animals. But privately, they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. You know, people love to say the woods are peaceful. Quiet, safe. But the terrifying thing about all three of these stories is that nothing sounded wrong before those people vanished. No screams. No struggle. No warning. Just a child sitting 10 feet away, a son waiting beside a tree, a little girl playing outside her family's cabin, and then suddenly, nothing. As if the forest itself reached out and erased them. And maybe that's what makes cases like these so unsettling. Not the idea that something is out there in the woods, but the possibility that it can stand right beside you, silently watching, and you'd never know it was there until it decides to take you. Thank you so much for watching. Some stories you hear seem to sit right on the edge of what we understand. They feel like they could be true, they have all the pieces of a real event, but there's always one detail, one piece of the puzzle that just doesn't fit into our world. Tonight, we're going to look at 3 such stories. They are separated by time and distance, but they all share that one chilling detail that pushes them from the ordinary into something else entirely. We begin on a quiet farm in rural Ohio in the summer of 1921. A young man named Carl Logis stood on the porch of his new farmhouse, looking out at the land he now owned. It was a warm evening, and the crickets were chirping their endless song. He took a deep breath of the country air. This was it. This was everything he had ever worked for. Carl was not a complicated man. He had a simple dream. One that he'd held on to since he was a boy, to own his own piece of land, to work it with his own 2 hands, and to live a quiet, self-sufficient life. And now, against all odds, he had it. The farm was modest, with a small house, a sturdy barn, and a reliable water well. The fields stretched out into the darkness, promising a future of hard work and honest reward. He'd even managed to buy it for a surprisingly low price. The family who sold it to him had been in a huge hurry to leave. They didn't say much about why, just that they were ready for a change, ready for the city. Carl didn't ask too many questions. A good deal was a good deal, and he saw it as his good fortune. He stepped off the porch, a lantern in one hand, its yellow light cutting a small circle in the deep darkness of the night. He had a pistol holstered on his hip, more out of habit than any real sense of danger. It was time for his final check of the animals before turning in for the night. His horses and cattle were his livelihood, and he took their care seriously. As he walked across the yard, the crunch of his boots on the dry soil was the only sound besides the crickets. He looked back at his little farmhouse, its windows dark, and then ahead towards the large, dark shape of the barn. He felt a swell of pride. This was all his. He was alone out here, master of his own small world. And then, the feeling came. It was sudden and sharp. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind that makes you feel like you've been caught doing something you shouldn't. He felt with absolute certainty that he was being watched. He stopped dead in his tracks. But that was impossible. He lived completely alone. His nearest neighbor was miles away. There were no roads nearby that people would be walking on this late at night. It was just him, his land, and his animals. Instinctively, he whipped around, raising the lantern high. The light swung wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to jump and flee. He scanned the open fields, the line of trees in the distance, the area around the farmhouse. Nothing. Just the empty, dark landscape. He listened intently, holding his breath. He heard nothing but the wind rustling through the tall grass. His practical mind immediately started searching for a rational explanation. A predator, maybe? A coyote or a fox? He looked around again. The night was peaceful. The crickets hadn't stopped their chirping, which they usually did if a large predator was near. And the previous owners hadn't mentioned any problems with dangerous animals in the area. He shook his head, a small, frustrated sigh escaping his lips. He was just being paranoid. That had to be it. He was new to this property, new to living so isolated. Every little sound, every shadow was magnified by the darkness and the silence. He told himself to calm down, that he was just letting his imagination get the better of him. Go check your animals and go to bed, he muttered to himself. Everything is fine. He turned and continued his walk to the barn, his pace a little quicker than before. He slid open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar smells of hay and livestock filled the air, and the gentle sounds of the animals shifting in their stalls were comforting. He set about his work, topping off their water, checking their feed, making sure everything was secure for the night. He busied himself for a few minutes, his mind focused on the simple, repetitive tasks. For a little while, he managed to forget about that strange, unsettling feeling he'd had outside. He was finishing up, giving one of his horses a final pat on the neck when the feeling returned. This time, it was even stronger. It was an intense, piercing feeling, as if a pair of eyes were boring right into his back. He stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned to look out the open barn door. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. He scanned the dark corners of the barn itself, the hayloft above. Nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. He was not alone. He tried to tell himself again that it was just his nerves, but deep down, a cold knot of fear was tightening in his stomach. The walk back to the farmhouse, which a few minutes ago had been a source of pride, now seemed like a long and treacherous journey through enemy territory. But he couldn't stay in the barn all night. He took a deep breath to steel his resolve. He picked up his lantern, and his other hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip, his fingers resting on the worn leather of the holster. He stepped out of the barn and began walking quickly towards the house, his head on a swivel, scanning the darkness on either side of him. He was about halfway across the yard when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was on the far side of his property, out in the distance. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his lantern, aiming the beam in that direction. The light was weak at that distance, but it was enough. He could clearly see a figure. Someone was standing on his land. They were just standing there, perfectly still, a tall, pale silhouette against the dark fields. It looked almost white in the dim light. For a second, Carl was too shocked to move. He just stood there, holding the lantern, staring at this silent intruder. The figure was standing near his water well. Finally, his shock gave way to anger. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the quiet of the night. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to flinch. It just stood there, seemingly staring right back at him. Then, slowly, it turned and began to move. It wasn't walking or running. It was more like it was gliding, moving away from Carl and towards the water well. That's when Carl's fear and anger boiled over. This was a trespasser. This must have been who was watching him earlier. Were they trying to rob him? Scope out his property? He wasn't going to let them get away. He drew his gun from its holster and started running towards the figure, shouting for them to stop. As he ran, the lantern in his other hand swung back and forth, making the light unsteady. The white figure seemed to flicker in and out of view between the bouncing shadows. He was closing the distance, but the figure was moving with an unnatural speed. He lost sight of it for a moment behind a small rise in the ground. By the time he reached the water well, panting and out of breath, the person was gone. They had just vanished. He stood there, scanning the area in every direction. There was nowhere for them to have gone so quickly. The fields were wide open. There were no trees or buildings to hide behind. It was as if they had just dissolved into the night air. Carl didn't know what to think. Was this person playing games with him? Had they circled back around to his house while he was chasing them? The uncertainty was terrifying. All he could think to do was yell out into the darkness. He warned them that he had a gun and he wasn't afraid to use it. He told them to get off his property and never come back. But his threats were met with nothing but silence. The crickets had stopped chirping now. The night was eerily still. For a long time, Carl just stood there by the well, his gun still in his hand, his eyes straining to see any sign of movement in the darkness. But the figure never reappeared. Eventually, the cold night air began to seep into his bones. He knew he couldn't stand out here all night. With one last paranoid look around, he turned and ran the rest of the way to his farmhouse. He burst through the door, slammed it shut, and slid the bolt home. The next morning, with the sun streaming through his windows, the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. Carl tried to rationalize it. It must have been a local prankster, or maybe a neighbor who was too shy to introduce themselves properly. Or perhaps it was a would-be thief who got scared off when Carl shouted and drew his gun. Whatever it was, he told himself it was a one-time thing. He had stood his ground, and they wouldn't be back. He desperately wanted to believe that. But he was wrong. That night, and almost every single night for the next year, the same thing happened. Around 9:30 p.m., just as Carl would be heading out to the barn for his final check, he would see the figure. It was always there, standing at a distance, a pale shape watching him from the edge of his property. It never got any closer, and he could never make out any features. It was just a silent, ever-present observer. Every night, Carl would scream at it, curse at it, tell it to leave. He would run towards it, his gun in his hand. One night, in a fit of rage and desperation, he even fired a shot in its direction. But every single time, the outcome was the same. The figure would turn, glide silently towards the water well, and then, right around that area, it would simply vanish. As the months wore on, Carl's initial anger and fear slowly turned into a kind of weary resignation. He wanted to believe it was just a persistent trespasser, someone with a strange obsession who was impossibly good at hiding. But he knew deep down that wasn't the case. Though he was not a superstitious man, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The way it moved, the way it disappeared into thin air, it had to be a ghost. What else could it be? And then he would remember the family who sold him the farm, how eager they were to leave, how they practically gave the place away. He started to think that maybe their hurry to get out had something to do with his nightly visitor. But as terrifying as it was to live with a ghost on his property, Carl clung to one fact. It was predictable. It appeared at the same time, in the same area, and it never did anything more than just watch. It never came near the house, never bothered his animals. It was a frightening, but ultimately harmless, part of his new normal. He learned to live with it. That is, until the 1st of August 1922, almost exactly 1 year to the day after he had bought the farm. On that day, something changed. Carl went out to water his horses and cattle, just as he did every day. But this time, they wouldn't drink. They shied away from the troughs, snorting and stamping their feet nervously. They acted as if the water was poisoned. Carl was baffled. It was the same water from the same well they had been drinking for a year without any issue. He cupped his hands and tasted it himself. It tasted fine to him, clean and fresh. But the animals were adamant. Something was wrong with the water. He realized the only way to solve the problem was to clean out the well. He would have to drain all the existing water, scrub the inside, and let it refill with fresh, clean groundwater. So, Carl went over to the well, the very spot where the ghostly figure disappeared every night. He set up the pump and began the long, laborious process of draining it. As the water level slowly dropped, he peered down into the dark opening. He saw something. There was something large at the bottom of the well, something that had been hidden deep beneath the surface of the water. As the water level got lower and lower, the object became clearer. It wasn't a rock or a piece of old equipment. It was a tangled mess of what looked like old clothes and bones. His blood ran cold. He knew immediately what he had to do. He stopped the pump and ran to get the sheriff. The discovery at the bottom of the well reopened a 5-year-old cold case. It turned out that before Carl, and even before the family who sold him the farm, the property had been owned by a man named Frank Lerman. Frank had employed several farmhands, including a young man named Henry Lipenstick. One day, 5 years earlier, Henry had simply vanished. He had no family or close friends in the area, so most people just assumed he had packed up and left town to find work elsewhere. But one of Frank's neighbors had her doubts. She went to the sheriff at the time and told him that she didn't think Henry had just left. She thought Frank Lerman might have had something to do with his disappearance. She said the two of them argued constantly, usually about money. She could hear them shouting at each other from her own property. She said there was real, palpable tension between them. The sheriff had tried to investigate her claim. He went to speak with Frank, but just as the investigation was getting started, Frank abruptly sold the farm and moved away without a forwarding address. With no body and no real evidence of foul play, the sheriff had no choice but to close the case. Until now. 5 years later, the body found at the bottom of Carl Lugisa's well was identified as Henry Lipenstick. His remains were badly decomposed, mostly skeletal, but identification was confirmed. An autopsy revealed that Henry had died from blunt force trauma to the head. His death was officially ruled a homicide. Frank Lerman was tracked down, arrested, and charged with second-degree murder. He was found guilty, but the conviction didn't stick. After only 7 months, his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence from so long ago, and he was released. But there was one more detail, one final, chilling piece to the story. When they carefully removed Henry's remains from the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was still wearing a watch on his skeletal wrist. The watch was broken, its hands frozen in time. It had stopped at 9:35 p.m. This was almost precisely the time, every single night for a year, that Carl Logis had seen that white, ghostly figure running towards the well before disappearing. After Henry Lipenstick's body was finally recovered and laid to rest in a proper grave, Carl Logis never saw the white figure on his farm ever again. The haunting was over. Our next story takes us forward in time a bit to the winter of 1933 and to a grand castle in southern Poland. Inside one of the castle's many lavish sitting rooms, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg was hosting a party for his friends. The room was filled with laughter and the smoke from expensive cigars. Anton, already quite drunk, was attempting to pour another round of drinks. He weaved his way back towards the card table where his friends were playing blackjack, but he stumbled, spilling most of the liquor onto a priceless carpet. Instead of being embarrassed, he just found it hilarious. So did his friends. They all roared with laughter as he clumsily picked up the nearly empty glasses from the floor. As a joke, he continued to the table and handed out the empty cups, and his friends, equally drunk and jovial, played along pretending to toast with them. The dealer for the next round began to pass out the cards. And it was in that moment that a loud, groaning creak echoed down from the ceiling right above them. The sound was so distinct and so loud that it cut through the noise of the party. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up. A moment of silence fell over the room. In that sudden quiet, Anton grinned and waved a dismissive hand. "Oh boy," he said with a chuckle. "That's just the monk." Most of his friends at the table knew what he was talking about. They had all heard Anton's favorite story about the castle being haunted by a so-called hooded monk. But there was one new friend in the group that night who hadn't heard the tale. He looked at Anton with a confused expression. "The monk? What are you talking about?" The other friends groaned playfully. They knew what was coming. Anton's eyes lit up. He loved telling this story. He turned to his new friend and launched into his well-rehearsed tale. He explained that when he first took ownership of the castle, he was told by the previous owners that the entire estate was his to enjoy, with one exception. There was a single bedroom on the second floor that was to remain locked and untouched at all times. The reason, they claimed, was that the room was haunted by the malevolent spirit of a hooded monk who patrolled it endlessly. Anton admitted to his friends that he had always heeded the warning. He had never once set foot inside that room. He had dozens of other bedrooms, so he didn't need it, but more than that, a part of him actually believed the story might be true. He liked the idea that his grand castle had a genuine, terrifying secret. He concluded his story by pointing a finger towards the ceiling. "And that bedroom," he said with a dramatic flair, "is right above us. So maybe that creak we just heard really was the monk." Usually, his friends would just humor him and move on. It was just a silly ghost story Anton liked to tell. But tonight, the new friend's reaction changed the dynamic. He stared at Anton in disbelief. "Wait a minute," he said. "You're telling me you own this entire castle, but there's a room in it that you've never been inside just because of some old ghost story? Are you serious?" As he said it out loud, the other friends started to see it from a new perspective. It did sound a bit cowardly when you put it like that. Suddenly, Anton's fun ghost story made him seem weak. They all started to pile on. "Yeah, Anton, what's the deal?" "It's your castle." "You can't be scared of one little room." Anton's cheerful mood quickly soured. He tried to brush it off, telling them to forget it and get back to the card game. But his friends wouldn't let it go. They were drunk and looking for some fun, and now they had a target. The goading turned into a dare. "You know what you should do, Anton? You should spend the night in that room. Tonight. Prove to us you're not afraid." At first, Anton refused. But his friends were relentless, and his drunken pride was on the line. He couldn't stand them thinking he was a coward in his own home. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table. "Fine," he declared. "I'll do it. I'll spend the night in there. I'll show you all it's just a stupid story." He probably assumed that by the time the party ended, everyone would be too drunk and tired to remember the dare. He figured he could just slip away to his own comfortable bedroom and no one would be the wiser. But his friends did not forget. When the card game finally wound down and it was time for everyone to go to bed, they all stood up and looked at Anton. "All right, Anton," one of them said with a grin. "Time to go to your new bedroom. We'll walk you up." Trapped by his own bravado, Anton had no choice but to lead the procession. The group of men, some stumbling, made their way out of the sitting room, up the grand staircase to the second floor, and down a long, dark hallway. They stopped in front of a heavy, ancient-looking wooden door. This was it. The forbidden room. Anton nervously fumbled with the old iron key he had retrieved. He put it in the lock and turned it. The mechanism groaned in protest, but it opened. Before pushing the door open, he turned to look at his friends one last time, a silent plea in his eyes. He was hoping they would let him off the hook. But they just stared back, their faces a mixture of curiosity and drunken amusement. They weren't backing down. "Go on," one of them urged. Anton sighed, turned back to the door, and pushed it open. He and his friends peered inside. For the first time, Anton laid eyes on the room he had avoided for so long. It was anticlimactic. It was just a bedroom, filled with old, heavy furniture that was covered in a thick layer of dust and draped with cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. It was creepy, but it just looked like an old, unused room. "All right, get in there," his friend said, nudging him forward. Anton gave them a weak smile. "Okay, I'll see you all in the morning," he said, trying to sound confident. He stepped over the threshold into the dusty room. He then pulled the door shut behind him. His friends on the other side heard the distinct sound of the key turning in the lock. Anton was locking himself in for the night. Satisfied, his friends all walked back down the hall to their own guest rooms and went to sleep. Several hours later, in the dead of night, the silence of the castle was shattered. A terrible, blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It was a sound of pure terror, and it was clearly coming from the haunted bedroom where Anton was sleeping. His friends were jolted awake. They scrambled out of their beds and ran into the hallway, their hearts pounding. They rushed down the hall to the locked door and started banging on it, yelling Anton's name. They tried the handle, but it was locked solid, just as he had left it. "Anton, are you okay? Open the door," they shouted. But there was no response. The screaming had stopped as abruptly as it had started. Now, there was only a dead, heavy silence coming from inside the room. A wave of dread washed over them. The drunken dare didn't seem so funny anymore. That scream had sounded real. It was the sound of someone in mortal danger. Something was terribly wrong. They had to get in there. They threw their shoulders against the heavy oak door, but it wouldn't budge. They took a few steps back and rammed it together, again and again. The old wood splintered and groaned until finally, with a loud crack, the door flew off its hinges and crashed into the room. They stumbled inside, their eyes frantically searching the darkness. And then they saw him. The sight that met them was one they would never forget. Anton was lying on the bed, flat on his back. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with a look of unimaginable horror frozen on his face. He was dead. As they cautiously approached the bed, they saw the only sign of what might have happened to him. Around his neck, there was a thin, red line. It looked like a ligature mark, the kind of mark left by a rope or a wire. But there was no rope. There was no wire. There was nothing in the room that could have made such a mark. The windows were sealed shut from years of neglect. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle. Nothing was out of place, except for Anton, lying dead on the bed with that inexplicable red line around his throat. The authorities were called, and they conducted a thorough investigation. They searched the room from top to bottom. They confirmed what the friends already knew. The room had been sealed from the inside. There was no way anyone could have gotten in or out. They never found any kind of rope, cord, or weapon that could have caused the mark on Anton's neck. An autopsy was performed, but the medical examiner was baffled. They couldn't determine a cause of death. He hadn't been poisoned, and there were no other injuries. He was just dead. The case was a complete mystery. But it becomes even stranger when you learn the full story of the hooded monk, not just the watered-down version Anton used to tell at parties. The complete legend, passed down for centuries, was much more specific. The story went that an evil monk had been executed in that very room hundreds of years ago, and his vengeful spirit remained, forever, trapped inside. The legend also contained a specific warning. If anyone dared to spend the night in that room, the ghost of the monk would appear and strangle them to death with a thin rope. The thin red mark found on Anton Holberg's neck was a perfect match for the legend's description. To this day, his death remains officially unexplained. A young man who died alone in a locked room, seemingly at the hands of a ghost. Our final story takes us back to the very beginning of the 20th century, to southeastern Wales. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 20th of January, 1907, a 57-year-old salt merchant named Samuel Hughes was dozing off on a passenger train. Sam was bone-tired. He had been working for nearly 24 hours straight. He had left his home in the small town of Blackwood early the previous morning and taken the train an hour south to the larger town of Newport, where he conducted most of his business. He had spent all of Saturday, from dawn until late into the night, meeting with clients and managing his accounts. Now, finally, he was on the last train home. He could barely keep his eyes open, his head lolling with the rhythm of the train. All he could think about was getting home, greeting his wife, and collapsing into his own warm bed. He had made this trip hundreds of times. He knew the route by heart. Even in his exhausted state, he could feel the train begin to slow down, and his body knew it was time. On autopilot, he gathered his bags, stood up, and shuffled out of his carriage and onto the platform. The train hissed and then pulled away, its red lights disappearing into the dark. Sam stood on the platform for a moment, waiting for the familiar sight of his local station. But, as his tired eyes adjusted, a cold dread washed over him. This wasn't his station. This wasn't Blackwood. In his exhausted stupor, he had gotten off the train one stop too early. He let out a groan of frustration. The train was gone. This was 1907. There wouldn't be another one until morning. He didn't have a phone to call a cab. He was stranded, in the middle of the night, in a town he didn't recognize. He had two choices. He could try to find an inn and spend the night, or he could try to walk home. He wasn't even sure how far away Blackwood was from here. First things first, he needed to find someone to ask for help. He stepped off the deserted platform and started walking towards a few faint lights he could see in the distance. He didn't have high hopes of finding anyone out and about at this hour, in what was clearly a very small rural town. But to his surprise, he hadn't walked for more than a few minutes when he saw another person approaching an intersection up ahead. As they got closer, he saw the uniform and realized it was a police officer on his nightly patrol. A wave of relief washed over Sam. He flagged the officer down. The officer was a bit suspicious at first, seeing a well-dressed man with luggage wandering around in the middle of the night. Sam quickly explained his foolish mistake, how he'd gotten off the train at the wrong stop. He asked the officer if there was a place to stay nearby, or if it was possible to walk to Blackwood. The officer was friendly and helpful. He told Sam that there were a couple of inns in town, but if he was feeling up to it, Blackwood was only about an hour's walk away. The officer said if it were him, he'd probably just make the walk and get home. Sam thought about it. As tired as he was, the thought of sleeping in his own bed was too tempting. He decided to walk. He asked the officer for directions. The officer explained that it was a straight shot. He just needed to follow the main road for about an hour. He would eventually come to a bridge. Once he crossed that bridge, he would see signs for Blackwood. It was simple. Sam thanked the officer profusely, picked up his bags, and set off down the dark road, heading for home. Several hours later, a little after 3 a.m, Sam's wife Bess was wide awake in their home in Blackwood. She was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. She was worried. She knew Sam had a long day, but he should have been home by now. He was usually very predictable. For him to be this late without any word was highly unusual, and a knot of anxiety was tightening in her stomach. She sat there, listening to the old house creak and groan, her mind imagining all sorts of terrible things that could have happened. And then she heard it. It was Sam's voice, calling out her name from outside. Bess. I'm home! It sounded like he was just out front. He must have seen the lights on in the house and known she was waiting up for him. Bess was overcome with relief. He was safe. Her husband was home. She grabbed a candle, her hands trembling slightly, and hurried to the front door to let him in. She unlatched the door and pulled it open, a happy greeting on her lips. But the words died in her throat. It wasn't her husband. Sam was nowhere in sight. Instead, standing on her porch, just inches away from her, was a dark figure. It was tall and cloaked in black, and it was just standing there, silent and still, looking right at her. Bess froze. But strangely, she wasn't afraid. A bizarre sense of calm washed over her as she looked at this strange apparition. She didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but she felt no sense of threat. She just stood there, holding her candle, staring at the figure. And as she looked closer, she noticed a detail. On its head, the figure was wearing a black silk hat. Her husband Sam owned a hat just like it. In fact, he wore it almost every day. She knew for a fact he had been wearing it that morning when he left for Newport. She stared at this figure, wearing what looked like her husband's hat, and remembered hearing her husband's voice just moments before. She didn't imagine it. He had called to her. And then, Bess blinked. And in that instant, the figure was gone. It had simply vanished. The hat, the cloak, all of it. Her porch was empty. Now, the fear hit her. The calm was gone, replaced by a chilling terror. Had she imagined it all? What was happening? She thought maybe Sam was outside, hurt. Maybe he had called to her and then collapsed. She ran out of the house, holding her candle, and started searching the property, calling his name over and over. But Sam wasn't there. After a frantic search, she went back inside, her mind reeling. She sat up for a few more hours, waiting and watching, but Sam never came home. Eventually, exhausted and confused, she went to bed. When Bess woke up late the next afternoon, Sam still wasn't home. The bright sunlight made the strange vision from the night before seem even more unreal. She told herself she must have been half asleep, that she had dreamt the whole thing. Sam was fine, she reassured herself. He probably just got delayed in Newport and would be home soon. As she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay, she heard a sharp knock on the front door. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was Sam. She rushed to the door and opened it. It was a police officer, the same one who had spoken to Sam the night before. He had a grim expression on his face, and he removed his helmet. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I have some terrible news." He explained what had happened. The night before, Sam had followed his directions, walking along the dark road towards Blackwood. He had made it all the way to the bridge that the officer had told him about. He was so close to home. But somehow, either because he was so exhausted or because it was so dark, he had made a fatal misstep. He had fallen from the bridge. His body had been discovered that morning. As Bess listened, her world collapsing around her, her mind inexplicably flashed back to the dark figure on her porch. Without thinking, she asked the officer a strange question. "What time do you think he died?" The officer paused, a bit taken aback, but then he answered. He said that based on when he had spoken to Sam and how long the walk to the bridge would have taken, they estimated that he likely fell sometime around 3 a.m. The time was a perfect match. That was right around when she had heard Sam's voice and seen the figure. And then she thought of the hat. That distinct black silk hat. She had to know. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "When you found him, was he wearing his hat?" The officer looked confused by the question, but answered it. "No, ma'am," he said. "He wasn't wearing a hat at all. We couldn't find one at the scene." In that moment, Bess knew. As heartbreaking as it was, she knew exactly what she had seen on her porch. It hadn't been a dream or a figment of her imagination. Who or what she saw, the dark figure in the cloak wearing her husband's black silk hat, had been Sam's spirit. He had fallen from the bridge and died, and his soul had come home one last time to say goodbye. The figure wearing his hat was his way of letting her know it was really him. Bess would go on to tell her story to a local reporter, and the tale of the ghostly goodbye was printed in newspapers all across Wales, a haunting reminder that sometimes love is strong enough to cross even the final boundary between life and death. The strange thing about stories like these is that no matter how much evidence you uncover, one piece never seems to fit. A ghost seen at the exact moment of death. A locked room with no escape. A figure returning home after falling into darkness. Maybe some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Thanks for watching, and if you're brave enough for one more story tonight, there's a playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time.